They are the deadliest predators on the planet.
This was somebody that was interested in inflicting pain, and I was sure people had died there.
No killer is as cold, cunning, or bloodthirsty.
Police think they may be the remains of 15 victims of yet another so-called serial killer.
And they may be closer than you think.
He's the guy who's behind you in the supermarket line.
These killers don't hunt in search of food. They pursue perverted fantasies.
He became sexually aroused when he watched his grandmother kill a chicken, and he wanted to replicate that.
And they lust for power and control.
The death is prolonged in such a way that every excruciating pain that is imaginable is part of the thrill.
What creates these cold-blooded monsters? What drives their warped psyches?
There's the fusion of a sexual thought with violence, and it becomes sexually arousing to them.
Now, rare recordings of the voices and visions of serial killers.
I got the hand on her and got a nylon sock and started strangling her.
Plunge us deep inside their complex and twisted minds. Serial Psyche. March 22nd, 1999. A terrified woman runs down a country road. She's naked, except for a metal dog collar attached to a 6-foot chain. The young woman barges into a double-wide trailer, screaming for help. The homeowner calls 911.
Yes, I'm calling for a young lady that ran into the house saying she'd been raped. She's got a chain on her and everything. Please send someone right away. This lady is naked and everything else. She said they'd been holding her for 3 days.
And she told this amazing story, and this story was that she had been abducted in Albuquerque, that she had been chained up and kept in a sunken room in this man's house, chained to a post. She had a bed and she had a bucket for a toilet, and she had been systematically raped and tortured over a period of 3 days.
The woman's name is Cynthia Vigil. It's clear she has looked into the eyes of pure evil. Cynthia directs police to the home of David Parker Ray. And what they find there leads them to one of history's most horrifying series of crimes.
So when the sheriff's department responds into this house, they discover everything is exactly supports what Cindy Vigil's account of events were.
They find a room in disarray with clear signs of a struggle. Rich Leibeser is the lead case agent for the New Mexico State Police.
They soon went down one of the short hallways into another room, which they thought was a bedroom, and discovered all kinds of sadomasochistic sexual devices, the likes of which nobody had ever seen, that did not appear designed for pleasure. They definitely appeared designed to inflict pain. They had all been modified. Some had nails melted into the plastic and bent.
Then, police find a trailer next to the house, and none of them are prepared for what they discover.
So when you walk in the trailer, the first thing you're going to see is the centerpiece, which is a gynecological chair. A black gynecological chair, and immediately suspended above it is this rack of harnesses and pulleys and trusses, all of which had manacles on them. On the walls adjacent to it are devices that made the devices inside the house look like kids' toys. These were obviously painful kind of implements. I mean, I've never seen anything like it. This space was evil. This space was sinister and mean.
David Parker Ray calls this $100,000 soundproofed torture chamber his toy box.
As soon as I went into the trailer and saw what was inside the utility trailer, I had two reactions. First of all, I knew we were dealing with somebody that was very, very accomplished at this behavior, whatever it was. They were obviously consumed by this. This was very important to them, whatever was going on in this trailer. Second of all, I was sure people had died there.
David Parker Ray is a serial killer. This label places him in the most heinous category of these offenders. He's a psychopathic serial sexual sadist. Dr. Michael Stone and Dr. Gary Brucato are experts on violent crime, including serial sexual homicide. Together they authored the book, The New Evil: Understanding the Emergence of Modern Violent Crime.
David Parker Ray being an example of a charming man would go to bars and lure either prostitutes or other women who would be willing to go with him for a night of drinking, to his house, only to then end up an infamous toy box mobile home that he converted into a torture chamber.
Cynthia V. Hill is a 21-year-old prostitute and heroin addict. Ray knows her disappearance is unlikely to arouse suspicion. He can take his time with his victim, and she will experience unspeakable torture.
Hanging on the wall inside the utility room was a checklist, and it was how to handle a captured victim. And it had check boxes next to it, but it was an instruction manual how to deal with an abducted woman who was being tortured.
But before the torture began, the woman might be drugged and chained or hoisted to the ceiling and forced to listen to an extremely long, droning tape of Ray describing in detail all of the acts to which she was going to be subjected.
Commander Vernon Gebreth is a world-renowned homicide investigator. He trains law enforcement on how to deal with these extreme killers. Ray's introductory tape is a powerful element in his lectures to police officers.
This is probably one of the most horrendous tapes I've ever heard. And there's a few, I've heard some bad ones. I've heard of tapes of people being tortured, sexually tortured, but this one is terrible because you have that psychopathic monotone voice talking about what he's going to do to this party. And it's outrageous. And the tape describes what's going to happen to them. I'll play a segment.
Hello there, bitch. Are you comfortable right now? I doubt it. Wrists and ankles chained, gagged, probably blindfolded. You are disoriented and scared too, I would imagine. Perfectly normal under the circumstances. For a little while at least, you need to get your together. It is very relevant to your situation. I'm going to tell you in detail why you have been kidnapped, what's going to happen to you, and how long you'll be here.
That is scary. Did you hear that voice? He recorded that tape in July 23rd, 1993. I can't imagine how many women heard that tape before they were tortured and or killed. It's horrible.
Ray's tape is carefully designed to induce maximum terror and strip away any last shred of power, hope, or personal identity. This is key in satisfying the sexual sadist.
This is another part of that kind of meticulous behavior, but he had crafted this kind of ominous welcome to them just to put them in a psychological state of terror. And I think that's a method of control, but it's also, I think, because David enjoyed seeing fear and pain in another person.
Important element in a sadistic man committing serial sexual homicide is the reveling, the joyfulness in causing intense pain and humiliation to another human being.
The torture of that individual becomes sometimes a means in and of itself. The death is prolonged in such a way that every excruciating pain that is imaginable is part of the thrill.
David Parker Ray didn't want to kill him. He wants to cause them pain. It's the infliction of pain and watching the victims suffer that was exciting for him.
The tape offers insight into David Parker Ray's motives.
In my case, I cannot get off with a girl unless I hurt her first. That's basically the reason I'm into rape and slavery, and the reason that you're going to be subjected to a certain amount of pain. Actually, that pretty well covers it.
Yes, instilling the fear, psychologically breaking them down, making them compliant, and if you hear what he says, is that he is basically telling them, if you are docile and you work and you go along with this, you may eventually be released. So there's that hope. There's that piece of hope out there that maybe I'll get out of this, but it's going to hurt.
For Ray, prolonging the torture is critical.
He had knowledge of things like medical techniques where he would bring a person close to the brink of death and then revive them with medical equipment so that the individual did not die during the act, as much as they may have wished at the moment that they would have died.
Well, I believe I've told you about everything that I can. I cannot predict the future. I can't predict changes of procedure. And I can only give you advice. Be smart and be a survivor. Don't ever scream. Don't talk without permission. Be very quiet. Be docile and obedient. And by all means, show proper respect. Have a nice day.
David Parker Ray's crimes span more than 40 years. He's believed to have brutally tortured and killed more than 50 women.
I mean, investigatively speaking, I'd call him a human predator. Clinically speaking, I'd say he's a psychopathic sexual sadist. Theologically speaking, I'd call him the devil on earth. He's like a ghost, not looking for fame and glory or recognition, simply slipping through society like a dark cloud.
The most heinous breed of serial killers are identified as psychopathic sexual sadists. For them, murder is not enough. These monsters are addicted to rape and torture before they kill. At the core of their evil is that they are psychopaths. This is the diagnosis of 95% of serial killers. Dr. Brianna Fox is an expert on psychopaths, serial killers, and violent offenders.
A psychopath is somebody who is narcissistic, cold and callous. They have very low empathy for others, and they're very willing to break laws and norms to do exactly what they want. This is somebody who doesn't have a lot of emotion and who doesn't really feel bad when they commit crimes or hurt others. All of that is very characteristic of someone who's willing to commit crimes against other people, including murder.
Certainly, not all psychopaths are criminals, but it's frequently a trait of serial killers. And what makes them extraordinary is just how ordinary they appear. David Parker Ray is a master mechanic for the New Mexico State Parks Department.
He was very clever, if you think about it. Here he is, a state employee. I believe in 1995 he got an Employee of the Year award, okay? Because nobody knew what he was doing back in his little compound. He's a reliable employee. We don't need to supervise him. So here's a guy who's operating all separately from everybody else, and on the surface, everything looks fine.
Ray uses his psychopath's charm to convince victims to come to his home, only to end up in his so-called toy box. One of Ray's favorite tricks is to pose as a police officer. Investigators find authentic uniforms, gear, and badges in his home. Cynthia Vigil, the escapee from the toy box, had been lured in by this deceit.
One morning I was walking to a restaurant, and this guy came up to me and told me that he had asked for me. So I went over there, and he acted like a cop and told me I was under arrest. And he put his handcuffs on me, and he had me in his trailer, and he drove me to Elton Beach. And he did a lot of sick stuff.
Vigil quickly becomes one of David Parker Ray's sex slaves. He is now her master. She's horrified to find out that Ray has an accomplice. The toy box is also ruled by a mistress. New Mexico State Police investigate the home of 59-year-old David Parker Ray, a suspected sadistic serial killer. They find a soundproofed trailer outfitted as a torture chamber. The tools they discover inside the dungeon offer clear evidence of acts of unimaginable cruelty and terrifying insight into the mind of a psychopathic serial sexual sadist. But meanwhile, to his neighbors and co-workers, Ray is just a friendly, regular guy.
When you spoke to David, the David that you got was an intelligent, articulate, kind of wry sense of humor. You never got the feeling when you were talking to him that you were dealing with somebody that was inherently evil or was capable of this kind of behavior. He was excellent at shielding that part of himself from anybody.
David Parker Ray's charm not only attracts victims. In a shocking revelation, investigators discover that he has convinced accomplices to assist in his heinous acts, including his own daughter, Jessie Ray.
Also, he had a daughter that lure women to the toy box, but there was one incident where she bopped a woman over the head in a bar with a beer bottle after drugging her, and they brought her home and she was tortured.
Ray also has a live-in girlfriend who becomes his partner in crime for several years, named Cindy Hendy. Ray is the dungeon master. Hendy is the mistress. Shockingly, Cindy Hendy and Jessie Ray lure in victims, and Hendy also participates in the torture of the young women.
The fact that he incorporated a female accomplice, that's not very common. Not many serial killers have a female accomplice that actually participates in the sexual assault of another woman. While she was with him, she talks about doing 18 packages. Those are victims.
During this time, Ray also persuades a friend of Jessie's named Roy Yancey to join the group. Ray convinces Yancey to murder one of their torture victims, Marie Parker. Together, they dump her body in the desert outside of Truth or Consequences.
David seemed to have this ability to manipulate people, and he would surround himself with people who were easily controlled and easily manipulated, and who were much less intelligent than he was. As in a manner of speaking, he's brainwashing them. He's providing them with the things they want. He's making them feel good about themselves. He's filling a hole somehow in their life, and out of gratitude for that, or whatever that is, or out of this idea that they have this meaningful relationship with him, they'll basically do whatever he wants them to do.
After Cynthia Vigil's escape and the discovery of the toy box, David Parker Ray and Cindy Hendy are arrested. Ray claims he was just helping Vigil detox from her heroin addiction, and all the rough sex was consensual.
That was David's whole story, that any sex that they would have had during that time was consensual. She was a prostitute. He would pay her for that. This was his approach, and he was very, very confident in this kind of approach.
Meanwhile, the state police and the FBI set up a task force in nearby Truth or Consequences, New Mexico. They are convinced there must be more victims.
So what we were interested in doing was trying to kind of co-locate David with known missing persons. So if we could put David in the vicinity at the time that a particular person was reported missing, we could make some kind of a connection there and maybe follow that up as a lead and see if we could develop any evidence. What we were able to do was to show the possibility of upwards of 90 to 95 potential events, missing person events, that David Parker Ray was in that vicinity at the time. We can place him there at the time that person was reported missing.
But Ray's victims are tough to track. Typically, they are prostitutes or runaways, young women who won't be missed. After torturing and killing them, he cleverly hides the corpses in the vast New Mexico desert, or an Elephant Butte Lake next to his home. Investigators can't find any bodies, despite finding Ray's hand-drawn treasure map.
This is Elephant Butte Lake, Elephant Butte Reservoir, and it's 42 miles long. When we found the map that had X's on it, for example, one X would be up there, what we call Kettle Top, the large plateau off in the distance. And then there would be other X's, like over here by Rattlesnake Island. There would be an X down here in this part of the lake, which leads down to the Elephant Butte itself. And we had dive missions in all of those places, but you kind of get an idea of the challenge you're facing. Even in the best of conditions, it's very, very difficult to locate something underwater.
David Parker Ray has operated under the radar for decades. The number of victims is unknown. He skillfully hides his crimes, and law enforcement doesn't even realize there is a serial killer on the loose. But not all psychopathic serial sexual sadists enjoy lurking in the shadows. Some crave the media spotlight, like the brutal serial murderer known as bind, torture, and kill. Law enforcement is searching for more victims of one of history's most horrific and cunning serial killers, David Parker Ray. They developed leads on a possible 95 victims that could have been abducted by the prolific murderer. Ray has operated totally under the radar for over 40 years. But meanwhile, a different breed of sadistic serial killer is on the loose. One who craves the spotlight. January 15th, 1974. It's a quiet morning in this Wichita neighborhood. An armed invader cuts the phone line and forces his way into this home. Joseph Otero, his wife Julie, their 9-year-old son Joseph II, and 11-year-old daughter Josephine all hope this is only a robbery. The Oteros are bound and strangled to death, and there is clear evidence of sexual violence and torture. The young girl is hung on a pipe in the basement. The murderer masturbates on her lifeless body. The killer leaves no concrete leads, and the case goes cold. Then, in October, 3 suspects are taken into custody for the crime. And suddenly, a chilling letter arrives at the Wichita Eagle newspaper. The letter declares, "Those 3 dudes you have in custody are just talking to get publicity for the Otero murders. They know nothing at all. I did it by myself and with no one's help. Let's put it straight."
This was his homicide. He wanted credit for that. So he sends a letter to the press. Those 3 dudes that you are in custody did not do it. I did this. And then he begins to articulate that only someone who was at the crime scene would know the location and position of each of the bodies.
The writer signs the letter, "Yours truly, guiltily," with a postscript.
He then concludes with the fact that he will continue to kill, and he wants to be called BTK for bind, torture, and kill. And from now on, when you hear from me, it will be BTK.
The killer's real name is Dennis Rader. He's a church-going family man, respected in the community. Rader brutally murders at least 10 people. The hunt to find him will last over 30 years. Like David Parker Ray, he is also a psychopathic serial sexual sadist. But Dennis Rader is fueled by somewhat different desires. While David Parker Ray makes every effort to hide his crimes, Dennis Rader lobbies for publicity. Rader is thought to have been driven by narcissism. That means he feels he possesses unique talents and believes he's entitled to special treatment.
When he's a malignant narcissist, he gets off on the thrill that he's a threat, that he's somebody. In real life, he's nobody. But in this persona of the BTK, he's somebody to be reckoned with. And that's what's driving him.
Ray and Rader hunt for 2 different types of prey. David Parker Ray's anonymous victims go missing completely. But Dennis Rader targets ordinary citizens, and then he poses the corpses in provocative positions.
These victims were everyday people, residents of Wichita, Kansas. And basically, he had literally terrorized the city of Wichita because nobody knew where he would come in. People would come in, the first thing he would do is they'd go to their phone and pick it up to see if it was dead. That's how paranoid people became. Because in the newspapers it reported that he would cut the phone lines of each of these victims' houses. So that was one of his signatures.
After 3 more murders, Rader sends his next letter, asking, "How many do I have to kill before I get a name in the paper or some national attention?" David Parker Ray and Dennis Rader may be 2 different types of sexual sadists, but at their core, both are lethal psychopaths. So the key questions that still puzzle experts are, how do people become psychopaths? And then, how do they go on to be sadistic serial killers?
It's very important to make a distinction between what we would call primary and secondary psychopathy. It's certainly understood that the vast majority of serial killers are going to demonstrate some degree of psychopathy. But when we talk about primary psychopathy, we're referring to hereditary psychopathy, what we might call a bad seed. Secondary psychopathy is where an individual is so badly maltreated, neglected, abused, that the individual looks an awful lot like a person who from birth has this kind of proclivity, and it's sometimes difficult to tease them apart.
Dennis Rader had a fairly normal upbringing without any evidence of abuse, but he developed a fascination with torturing and killing animals.
If you look at his history, it would lead you to believe that this was a kid that had some issues when he was young. When he was a child, he admitted that he became sexually aroused when he watched his grandmother kill a chicken, and he wanted to replicate that. Children that do certain kinds of things, the killing of animals, those are kids that need watching, and those are kids that you need to attend to. But that never happened to Dennis Rader.
It appears David Parker Ray did suffer a cruel childhood. He grew up in an abusive, broken home. The socially awkward child was bullied in school, and in adolescence developed a fascination with drugs, pornography, sadomasochism, and murder. Ray claimed to have committed his first sadistic attack when he was a young teen, and he bragged about it in his journal.
Now you link psychopathy with sexual sadism, and what you have is a human predator.
Ray had a very peculiar split in his personality that seems to have developed in adolescence, where he was capable of viewing a woman as a good object that he could incorporate into his crimes, idealize a little bit, or view her as garbage. There's an infamous incident in the life of David Parker Ray where he told one of the female captives that he did not kill, if I recall. He turned to her and he said, "You know, if I had known that you were such a good woman, I wouldn't have thought of you as the type of person that I would torture in the toy box."
Another common trait of sadistic serial killers is their engagement in paraphilia, defined as abnormal sexual behaviors or impulses that play out through intense and recurring sexual fantasies and urges. The BTK Strangler always strives to perfect his techniques. He creates gruesome sketches and builds models of his fantasies.
He used a ball to strengthen his fingers because you have to keep your fingers very strong because it takes a lot to strangle someone.
Dennis Rader methodically scouts his victims and plans his attacks, all while carrying on with his normal life.
So in addition to being a church leader and a government worker for the city, he also was a Boy Scout leader, and they would go on camping trips. And he would use the camping trips as cover for him to go out and do a hit, because his wife believed he was on a camping trip. The kids were sleeping. He would leave the campsite, take a cab, go to the location that he had pre-surveilled, and attack his victim.
This aspect of planning their crimes is one area where Rader and Ray are alike.
In the case of BTK Dennis Rader and David Parker Ray, we see there's these tendencies to journal, to sketch things out, to plan out their future crimes. And this is both a way to relive the crimes that they committed in the past, to get pleasure out of it, much like we would look through a photo album of happy moments from the past, or to plan out the future crimes.
David Parker Ray even uses Barbie dolls in his planning.
He had taken these dolls and perverted them and turned them into kind of an action figure for S&M. I mean, they were naked. He had manufactured little devices to put on them, and they were decorations in his utility trailer.
What his disturbingly vivid diaries record is years of fantasies of torture that were worsened by the fact that he had an incredibly brilliant knack for creating devices, sort of technical devices.
Ray is a skilled mechanic and builder. At work, he is known to be a pack rat, bringing home scrap items to use on personal projects.
So this is the headquarters for the state park of Elephant Butte. David was employed here. He was employed with State Parks as a mechanic. If there were things that were left over, little bits and pieces that he could use, he would pack those away. We found a garage filled with it, just scrap and old tools and scrap metal. And that's some of the material he would use to create his devices. He had a ready supply of it right here at work.
For decades, Rader and Ray carried out their gruesome attacks. Ray feeling he's invincible and can't be caught, while Rader thinks he's smarter than the police and dares them to stop him before he kills again. Sadistic serial killers are the most brutal predators on the planet. David Parker Ray and Dennis Rader are two of history's most horrific examples of this kind of murderer. They both carry on their monstrous acts for decades. Their crimes are similar, but their motives and methods are very different. Often these crimes worsen over time as the killers habituate to the experience and need to intensify the sadistic acts to get the thrill they crave.
There are times where a sexually sadistic killer will jump immediately into serial killing. And in those cases, we tend to see where there's a slight escalation in the severity of their crimes, but more often we see it where they keep trophies of their offenses, and that helps them to relive the fantasy, to keep that high going that they had, and also the premeditation of their next crime.
Dennis Rader exhibits a rare behavior for a serial murderer. He is able to completely stop killing for long stretches of time. He takes 5 victims in 1974, 2 in 1977, then 1 a year in 1985, 1986, and 1991. His last correspondence with the press is received in 1988. Commander Vernon Gebreth is brought in as a consultant on both the Ray and BTK cases.
So he remained dormant. If you think about it, from 1988 to 2004, nobody heard anything about him. Now, the old caveat in cases like this is that the serial killer is either in jail or has died. Well, guess what? BTK just rewrote the book. It changed all the rules. He actually remained dormant all these years. Now, how did he do that?
Dennis Rader stashes away trophies taken from his victims and uses them to play twisted autoerotic games. He engages in self-bondage and takes selfies.
So Dennis Rader, in some instances, would actually wear the clothing of the victim or dress like the victim and put a mask over his face, okay, and put himself in the same position as the victims he had killed. And he was able to relieve himself sexually like that.
In one photo, he digs a shallow grave and wraps himself in plastic and wears a frightening mask. In another, he suspends himself upside down from the trees, all keeping the memories of his victims alive, fulfilling his fantasies, and allowing him to stop killing. By By 2004, the case goes cold. It's assumed BTK is in jail or dead.
2004, he announces that he's back. And why is he making that announcement? Because the Wichita Eagle had a special front page edition 30-year anniversary of the BTK killings, which basically set him out again to come forth.
Over the next 12 months, BTK sends 11 communications confirming his role in several earlier murders, with gruesome photos and victims' driver's licenses and ID badges. One chilling letter confirms BTK's new intentions.
This letter was more intense. It was scary because he ends up with a threat. I have spotted a spoiled latchkey kid. Just have to work out the details. I think fall or winter would be just about right for the hit. So now he's putting the authorities on alert that he's now about to strike. He's identified his possible victim, and this is putting a whole new spin on it. The pressure on the authorities is unbelievable.
Now in Wichita, 30 years after BTK first appears, a long dormant horror is about to rear its head once again. David Parker Ray, the Toy Box Killer, and Dennis Rader, the BTK Strangler, are two of the most evil serial killers in the annals of crime. Both remain on the loose for decades. After 3 days of torture, Cynthia Vigil manages to escape. While David is out, she's able to overcome Cindy Hendy and get free. Finally, Ray's reign of terror comes to an end. Police find incriminating evidence at the crime scene, but the few victims that survived were so heavily drugged and brainwashed that their testimony is not considered credible. Investigators hunt for definitive evidence of murder. They continue to scour the desert and the lake for bodies, but they still come up empty. In the courtroom, the judge rules against playing Ray's introductory audio tape, and in the first trial, there's a hung jury. Prosecutors cannot let this monster go free, so they retry the case. Still, they can't convict Ray of murder without a body. But this time, the tape is played for the jury. And finally, in 2001, he is convicted for kidnapping and torture and is sentenced to 224 years in prison.
David showed zero remorse for anything. It wasn't that he didn't understand the ramifications of what he's doing. He just didn't care.
His daughter Jessie Ray cooperates with the prosecution and only receives probation. Cindy Hendy is sentenced to 36 years. She is released on probation in 2019 after serving half her sentence. Roy Yancey also cooperates and agrees to take police to the site of Marie Parker's body, but the body isn't there.
He realized that more than he knew where that body was. He went back, dug that body up, and put it someplace else. Very smart, very clever, very evil. So when Roy Yancey, who was arrested, admitted to what he had done, he actually brought the authorities out there. This is where the body was. But the body wasn't there anymore.
Roy Yancey is sentenced to 22 years for the murder of Marie Parker. David Parker Ray is sent to prison, but just 8 months later, he dies of a heart attack.
So he dies 8 months into his sentence at a prison facility in Hobbs, New Mexico. And it was frustrating for us because that ended any possibility we had, or the best possibility we had, of being able to take something to the families of his victims and say, here's what happened. These people are still at home with pictures of their daughters somewhere in that house, and that daughter is dead. She's gone. And we couldn't do anything about that. That is what was the frustration with David's death for all of us.
By 2004, 3 decades after Dennis Rader's first murder, The case had been declared cold. But then the letters and other correspondence flood into Wichita media outlets. The BTK Strangler's ego and narcissism are his downfall. Eventually, the police trick him into sending a floppy disk to the newspaper. Officers are able to trace the computer files to a desktop machine located at Christ Lutheran Church in Wichita. Quickly, they identify the source: Dennis Rader, president of the Congregation Council. BTK is finally stopped. In BTK's shocking courtroom confession, he describes his methods of trolling, then stalking his victims. Coldly, he refers to his targets as projects, like Catherine Bright, his 6th victim.
I had many, what I call them projects. They were different people in the town that I followed, watched. Kathleen Bright was one of the next targets. But anyway, it just was basically a selection process. Worked toward it. If it didn't work, I just move on to something else.
That part of the plea agreement was that he had to admit to each of these cases in front of the families of the victims, which he did. And when he articulated that, it was almost like he was reading a laundry list. No emotion. No emotion. He talked about, well, I realized they saw me, so I had to put them down. That's an expression used for animal control, putting them down. That's what he said. I had to put them down. Just like that.
The psychopath's lack of sympathy is clearly evident through BTK's 45-minute statement.
I strangled her with a belt. I took the belt off and retied that with pantyhose real tight, and at that time masturbated her.
In August 2005, 60-year-old Dennis Rader receives 10 consecutive life sentences. Sadistic serial killers may carry no remorse or sympathy for their prey, but concern for the victims and their families must never be ignored.
I think that when we talk about serial killing, mass killing, spree killing, and we become interested in understanding how people can do these things and so forth, fascinated, horrified, sometimes simultaneously, what I have found often gets lost is the fact that what we're talking about are crimes that involved real human beings.
Given the fact that so many victims of serial killers are females and they're younger women, I find it really difficult to dissociate from that. When I see these crime scene photos, when I read about what had happened to these women, oftentimes I think that could have been me, or that woman looks like me, and it's really difficult to not feel the pain, to feel the fear that they must have felt when they were about to go through these horrible experiences, and I just want to be able to prevent this type of thing from happening in the future.
I think the right way to present these kinds of cases is to see if there's something to learn from them. I would like to see, whether it's David or BTK or anything else, a presentation of how does somebody evolve into this? How does that happen? And is there anything that can be done to prevent it? Because by doing so, you're literally saving somebody's life somewhere. You don't know them, but they have a family. They're important in their world, and they don't deserve to die the way these women die.
What motivates a serial killer? For some, it's sheer hatred against humankind.
He was punishing those who had the good fortune to be raised in a warm, loving home.
Some of these murderers seek revenge for an abusive childhood.
They're destroying him out of a need for vengeance.
And then there are others who just simply love to kill.
Israel Keyes killed because he enjoyed it. He got adrenaline rush from it. He loved the thrill of it.
What creates these cold-blooded monsters? What drives their work psyche? Now, the actual voices and visions of serial killers.
Once I started, and there was nothing else like it.
Plunge us deep inside their complex and twisted minds. February 1st, 2012. It's a cold winter's night in Anchorage. A heinous crime is about to be committed. 18-year-old Samantha Koenig is working alone at the Common Grounds Coffee Hut.
A little bit before closing time that night, a tall man in a dark coat walked up to the window and he ordered an Americano coffee. And he stood there and watched as Samantha turned around and made it. When she turned back around, he had pulled a gun on her.
Shocked and surprised, Samantha raises her hands as if being held up.
He tells her it's a robbery. She kind of steps back, surprised. He then ends up coming in through the window, climbs in through the window, and ties her up with some zip ties, and then forces her at gunpoint out of the coffee stand and walks her back to his car.
The abductor's name is Israel Keys. He is a serial killer, responsible for a steady string of brutal murders for more than a dozen years.
Keys didn't have a real victim profile. He was pretty unusual for serial killers. He didn't have a certain race or a certain age or a certain sex that he targeted. He was much more random. It was more opportunity crimes with him, just who happened to be at the wrong place at the wrong time. And for Samantha Koenig, she was at the wrong place at the wrong time. Keys had decided that he was going to rob this particular Common Grounds coffee shop. That's originally what he planned on doing, just robbing it. But when he got to it, when he saw Samantha, he changed his mind and decided to take her.
Keys tries to keep his captive calm by telling her it's only a kidnapping. He's going to hold her for ransom. He takes Samantha Koenig to the shed next to his home and binds and gags her. Incredibly, his live-in girlfriend and 10-year-old daughter are in the house just several feet away.
He took her into the shed, closed it up, tied her up in there, left her in the shed. He then actually got information from her and went to her house where her truck was parked outside to get her wallet, to get her ATM card and some other things. Came back to the shed where she was still subdued, and then that's when he raped her.
Still, Samantha prays she will survive this horror. Hoping it's only a kidnapping, she gives Keys her ATM PIN number. But she never had a chance once Keys made up his mind back at the coffee hut. Keys strangles the helpless young woman.
Well, he enjoyed the thrill, the adrenaline rush of it. He enjoyed having control over his victims. He enjoyed seeing their fear. He raped his victims, we know that.
Astoundingly, after the murder, Keys immediately returns to his normal life.
So after he kills Samantha, he drank a glass of wine calmly, went back into the house where his daughter was sleeping and his girlfriend was sleeping. And later on that very morning, they all leave for a pre-planned vacation. They fly to Houston and then drive to New Orleans for a cruise, for a one-week cruise.
Keys doesn't have time to dispose of Samantha's body prior to the trip.
Before leaving, he had put Samantha's body in a cabinet in the shed. The thought being that it's so cold in Anchorage in the middle of winter that her body would be perfectly preserved there while he was gone.
Meanwhile, a frenzied hunt begins for Samantha. Her dad launches a grassroots campaign to find his daughter. Upon returning home, Israel Keys calmly checks back on Samantha's corpse.
When he gets back, Samantha's body's frozen solid in the cabinet there. He has some difficulty getting it out, actually. He takes the body out, thaws it out with heaters, has sex with the corpse.
Then, in a horrifying turn, Keys makes a successful ransom demand by sending a photo of the young woman made up to appear alive. He applies makeup, sews her eyes open with fishing line, and poses the body alongside an edition of the Anchorage Daily News from 4 days earlier.
And then ultimately ends up cutting her up into pieces, dismembering the body to get rid of it. Puts her body parts in trash bags and hauls them to a lake, a frozen lake near Anchorage, and cuts a hole in the ice, drops the bags into the water, weighs them down, and lets them sink to the bottom of the lake.
On March 6th, with her ATM card in hand, Israel Keys flies to Las Vegas and rents a car. And a dramatic chase begins. At this point, police think they are tracking a kidnapper. They have no reason to believe he is a serial murderer. They have no clues to his identity and no concept of the enormous depth of his crimes. Keys is a 34-year-old psychopathic serial killer, and like so many of these monsters, he's able to commit these grisly crimes while still carrying on a normal life.
Somehow he was able to just maintain this dual existence, having these two separate identities, the one of the family man, the devoted father, and the one as the killer.
Detective Malcolm Ryman encountered these types of violent psychopaths for over 30 years as a New York City Police Department homicide investigator. He specialized in sexual predator and serial killer cases.
People expect to see serial killers as being some type of drooling maniac, creepy, maniacal person, and it's not really the case. And what you'll often find is they're charming, articulate, friendly, normal people.
The FBI defines psychopathy as a personality disorder manifested in people who use a mixture of charm, manipulation, intimidation, and sometimes violence to control others and satisfy their own selfish needs. Psychopathic serial murderers have no empathy for their victims and no remorse for their crimes. And sadly, they're surprisingly hard to spot.
Israel Keys had his own business. He had a construction business. All his clients reported that he seemed very normal. He seemed very friendly most of the time. He seemed nothing unusual about him. The neighbors reported. He just seemed like a normal, friendly guy from all appearances.
But Israel Keys is far from normal. He sets out from Las Vegas on a determined drive across the Southwest. He heads through Arizona, New Mexico, and Texas. Along the way, he stops several times to withdraw ransom money from Samantha's ATM account.
When he made the withdrawal, there would be a ping basically on the investigator's system. They would know, oh, the card's been used at this location. So they would rush to the location, but of course by the time they got there, Keys was long gone. He was off in another town somewhere else.
Investigators still have no idea who the kidnapper is, what kind of car he's driving, or if Samantha is with him on his journey. Meanwhile, Samantha's disappearance has now gained national attention, fueled by her father's relentless efforts to save his daughter. Israel Keys is cleverly staying one step ahead of law enforcement. But then, the man known as the most meticulous serial killer of the 21st century makes an uncharacteristic mistake. And police uncover shocking truths about this heartless serial killer. Alaska serial killer Israel Keys abducts 18-year-old Samantha Koenig and brutally rapes and murders the young woman. He stashes her body in a cabinet and calmly leaves on a family vacation. Upon his return, he dismembers the corpse and drops the remains in a frozen lake, but still convinces her father and the police she's only been kidnapped. Now, law enforcement is tracking Keys through the Southwest United States by the use of Samantha's ATM card, hoping she is still alive. What's going on inside the warped mind of this killer, and what drives him towards these heinous acts? Keys is energized by his crime and craves more thrills.
Well, in addition to using the ATM card while he was in Texas, Keys also decided he was going to rob a bank. This is something he'd done before. He'd robbed several banks before in the past. He found a house in a small town in Texas, Salado, Texas. He broke into the house, burglarized it for what he could, and then set it on fire. And the point of setting it on fire was for diversion. So in other words, he planned on the fire drawing out the police from the nearby town so that he could then go to the town and rob the bank, which he did. He went and robbed the bank in Alego, Texas.
The anonymous murderer continues across the Southwest. But finally, investigators catch a break. It's an uncharacteristic slip-up for a killer whose precise planning has kept him under the radar for many years. At one of his ATM withdrawals, the security camera catches a glimpse of Key's rental car. It's a white 2012 Ford Focus.
And it wasn't until they got the video of his rental car that they had something concrete they could actually search for. So then the FBI put out a bolo, be on the lookout for this 2012 white Ford Focus.
On March 13th, a Texas highway patrolman spots the white Ford in the parking lot of a Quality Inn motel in Lufkin, Texas.
Keys got in the car, drove off, and they pulled him over. In the car, they found, in addition, obviously, to the strangeness of this driver having an Alaska driver's license, they also found Samantha Koenig's cell phone. They found Samantha Koenig's ATM card, a gun, cash with ink stain on it from robbery, and they knew they had their guy.
Before we ask any questions, you must understand your rights. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can be used against you in court. You have the right to talk to a lawyer for advice before we ask you questions. You have the right to have a lawyer with you during questioning. If you cannot afford a lawyer, one will be appointed for you before any questioning.
The Anchorage police and the FBI interrogate Keyes, still having no idea he may be involved in any other murders. Sadly, on March 31st, 2012, he gives a gruesome confession of Samantha Koenig's torture and murder. And then, the complex psychology of Israel Keyes begins to unveil. He hints that there are other victims, many other victims.
There is no one who knows me, or who has ever known me, who knows anything about me, really. They know they're going to tell you something that does not line up with anything I tell you because I'm two different people, basically. And the only person who knows about what I'm telling you, the kind of things I'm telling you, is me.
How long have you been two different people?
Long time. 14 years.
Over the next 9 months, investigators attempt to piece together other crimes Keyes may have committed. More than 40 hours of complex interrogation and psychological maneuvering reveals a killer with a shockingly precise method for serial murder.
In the case of Israel Keyes, even after he was arrested, he still felt the need to try to control the situation, control law enforcement, and make the situation as beneficial for himself, despite the fact that he was apprehended as a serial killer. So for example, he was only willing to give very limited information to police, even though they had arrested him. So he was willing to negotiate, but he had very specific stipulations associated with all of the information he was willing to give out, and he was only willing to give out more once the stipulations were fulfilled.
Investigators hope he'll cooperate and help bring closure to the victims' families, while Keyes often focuses on receiving coffees and cigars.
First of all, do I get a cigar today? What I can do is I can give you something. All right, we'll get that cigar. There was a bank robbery in Tupper Lake. Well, that was me, and I'm sure it was probably the only bank robbery in that town for a while. So
Security cam photos confirm Keyes' account. The investigators and Keyes share a laugh about using real hair for his disguises. Keyes' response is chilling.
You use real hair. Where do you buy real hair?
You don't have to buy real hair to get real hair.
Fair enough. I guess
You just take it, don't you? Hair is free. Everything's free if you take it.
He wanted to have control. He seemed to enjoy toying with the investigators as well. He would generally allude to certain crimes without giving details or specifics, leaving the investigators wanting more and more from him and kind of drawing them along that way.
Interrogating these cunning serial killers can be very challenging for investigators. Detectives call the interrogation room the box.
When I'm in the interview room, when I'm in the box with the serial killer, before I go in there, I want to know everything about that person. I want to know every intricate detail about that person's life. I want to know about the traumatic things that happened in childhood. I want to know about previous crimes. I want to know everything about them. I want them to feel transparent. I want them to feel like there's nothing that they can hide from me that either I know or I'm going to find out.
Experienced detectives learn how to read nonverbal cues and how to manipulate the suspect to get the information they need. Investigators notice that Israel Keyes gets physically excited when he talks about his kills, rapidly tapping his hands and feet and jangling his shackles. It's a way detectives know when he is telling the truth. With Israel Keyes, this process is extremely difficult. Keyes agrees to continue to cooperate on the condition that they keep his name out of the press.
We could work out some sort of agreement that, I give you all the answers on these cases, and families get closure, and you find as many of them as possible, and in return for that, I don't plan on being around a whole lot longer, but a really big concern to me is, my kid's going to be around. I don't want her to, type my name in the computer and have it pop up,
He doesn't want his 10-year-old daughter to hear about his grisly crimes.
I'm not in this for the glory.
And I don't see why the media has to get involved at all.
FBI Special Agent Jolene Godin is part of the interrogation team.
He wanted the death penalty and he wanted it fast. It was, speaking generally, that was what he wanted. There were little things along the way that he wanted. He wanted evidence returned to family members and things like that. But big picture, what he wanted to avoid trials. He wanted to avoid publicity in media. He wanted to avoid being taken from jurisdiction to jurisdiction and tried in multiple places. And ultimately, he wanted the death penalty, and he wanted it quickly. He didn't want to sit in jail for a long period of time.
Investigators tell Keyes he won't get the death penalty without other victims. He slowly begins to reveal information about others he murdered. They learn that Keyes has been eluding capture through brilliant planning. He has studied the serial killers of the past and idolizes Ted Bundy. But they're shocked to discover that there's never been any serial killer quite like Israel Keyes. The FBI and the Anchorage, Alaska Police Department are deep into the interrogation of serial killer Israel Keyes. Keyes has already confessed to one heinous murder, but now investigators are unraveling horrifying layers of complex and unspeakable crimes.
So Keyes viewed the entire country as his hunting grounds. So what he would do is, even though he was based out of Alaska, out of Anchorage, he would fly to another city. Say for example, he'd fly to Chicago. Once he got there to Chicago, he would rent a car. He'd then drive that car to a different state or through multiple states, putting on hundreds, even thousands of miles before he got to where he actually committed the crime. So the crime was committed thousands and thousands of miles away, multiple jurisdictions, so it made it very difficult to try to track him or come up with any sort of suspect in the crimes.
Everything was meticulously planned, and our interviews with him were the same from his standpoint. I mean, I never got the sense that he, accidentally told us something or got angry and riled up and then something flew out of his mouth. My sense was that he knew every time he came in kind of what he was going to give us that day.
In the chilling interview, Keyes talks about his inspiration and his motives.
Stuff about other people like that?
I probably know every single serial killer that's ever been written about. It's kind of a hobby of mine. I don't really consider myself all that different or all that special from hundreds of thousands of other people. All you have to do is type in a word search on any given porn site, and there's all kinds of people who have fantasies about rape and bondage and kinds of things that I take to another level. I think with me it's a combination of things. It's not it's not just about the sexual fantasies, and it's definitely not just about the money, and it's not just about the adrenaline, but it's all of those things together, and that's what I get out of it. And once I started doing, once I started, and there was nothing else like it.
In his intricate planning, Keyes even goes so far as to bury pre-packed murder kits in at least 5 states around America.
Israel Keyes put so much thought and preparation and planning into his crimes. He would use what he called kill kits. These were 5-gallon plastic buckets. He would then put certain things in the buckets that he wanted to use for his crimes. He would put guns in the buckets, he would put ammunition in the buckets, he would put zip ties in the buckets, he would put tape in the buckets, flashlights, whatever he thought he would need. He'd then seal up the bucket and bury it in the ground. He did this in multiple states. He did it in New York, he did it in Vermont, he did it in Washington, he did it in Alaska. Then he would return to these sites, sometimes years later, and dig up the bucket, get the items out, and then use them for the crime.
He even included caustic chemicals like Drano and lye to help dispose of the bodies. The kits allowed him to travel without any weapons or tools to avoid security concerns at airports. Keyes referred to his kits as buried treasures. Investigators find that Keyes uses guns to control his victims, but that's not how he likes to kill. Keyes takes investigators through the killing of Bill and Lorraine Currier in Essex, Vermont in June of 2011. 4,000 miles from Anchorage. It's a typical stalk and kill murder for this ruthless predator.
The Curriers were chosen mostly at random. And I say mostly at random because there was a little bit of a criteria involved. Not for the victims themselves, not for the Curriers themselves, but for their home. Keyes had certain things he was looking for that particular night. He wanted a 1-story building. He wanted a home with an attached garage. He wanted a home that it looked like there weren't any children there. And unfortunately for the Curriers, their home fit the profile to a T. He called it a blitzkrieg attack. He broke in through the garage. No one could see him. It was an attached garage, so he broke in the window in the garage door, broke into the kitchen of the house, immediately stormed into the Keyes' bedroom, and surprised them, subdued them, and took them away.
But Keyes says he was unhappy. It didn't go according to his plan, and he had to shoot Bill Currier.
He typically liked to strangle his victims to death. It was kind of a more personal murder, hands-on, literally, in the killing. So in the case of Bill Currier, as the murder victim in Vermont, he was shot and killed, which is very unusual for Keyes to do, and the reason why Keyes did it is Bill Currier was not cooperating, not following directions. Ultimately, it was the loss of control of the situation. There was screaming and shouting and was not following instructions, not following directions from Keyes. And this loss of control angered Keyes. It pissed him off. And he reacted violently, shot him multiple times.
Keyes states he was disappointed because he had other plans for Bill Currier.
He never specified what the other plans were, but Implied in that is that there was definitely some sort of torture that was in mind.
This idea of power and control often runs through the motives of many serial killers. For years, researchers have tried to identify and categorize what creates and drives these monsters. Israel Keyes fits in the categories of seeking power and control, as well as the sheer thrill of killing. Sex and torture are also common elements of serial murders, but these components are not always involved.
I see really two basic types that I've dealt with. And the first type being a sexual predator hunter who's going out and hunting down victims, seeking them out, and deriving some type of sexual pleasure in victimizing them. And then you have another type of serial killer who's exacting some type of revenge. It's a revenge killer. They're getting revenge from rejection, alienation, perceived slights against a group of people, and they're destroying them out of a need for vengeance.
Keyes seems to fit into the sexual predator hunter category, while another brutal serial killer from the Ukraine falls into the revenge category. Anatoly Onoprienko took the lives of at least 52 innocent victims. A 12-gauge shotgun was his weapon of choice.
Serial killer who was not oriented toward sexual homicide so much as just plain misanthropic killing of one person after the other would be this fellow Anatoly Onoprienko from the Ukraine.
Onoprienko's grisly crime scenes appear to express pathological rage against families, a hatred spawned by his own troubled childhood. When Onoprienko was just 4 years old, his mother died. His older brother stayed on with his father, but Anatoly was placed in an orphanage. Apparently, this abandonment fuels his homicidal rage.
He developed a hatred, for how he was raised and for mankind in general. He would often invade a house in these small town places and kill all the people in the house, sometimes several all at once, and then burn the house down in order to further get back at the people who had the advantage of living in a nice home, which he never could do, so that he was punishing those who had the good fortune to be raised in a warm, loving home.
Many serial killers claim they are on some kind of mission, driven by psychotic visions or voices.
To commit such crimes, you have to be given the right. But I can't prove who gave me the right. Maybe God gave me the right. How can I prove it when, for example, there are 6 billion people on Earth who claim to have seen God, but they can't prove it? But maybe I've seen God. Maybe I've received a concrete task from him, but I can't prove it.
Well, psychosis is more of there's a break with reality. The person views reality in a significantly different way than persons around them. They may have delusions, which are beliefs that have no basis in reality. They may experience voices that no one else around them hears. They may see things that no one else around them sees. They may be actually very disorganized in their thought. There's a clear break with reality. They're seen as mentally ill.
Serial killers sometimes fake psychosis in order to escape the death penalty. Onoprienko tried to use insanity as his defense, but the courts felt he was faking his mental illness, and he was sentenced to death.
There's no one course that makes an individual turn into or become a criminal. There's no one individual path. There's different things you want to look at, and that one is the family dynamics, the relationship with the family, the mother, the father, the relationship the mother and the father have with themselves.
Some experts believe Keyes' unconventional childhood played a role in fueling his desire to kill. Israel Keyes grew up in a remote forest outside the small town of Colville, Washington. He was one of 9 children. His family belonged to a strict religious group called the Ark, a church associated with racist and anti-Semitic theology. He was homeschooled and had little chance to socialize with other kids. He insists he wasn't abused or neglected as a child. But could the extreme isolation in his childhood be what transformed him into a monster? Serial killer Israel Keyes has operated completely under the radar for decades. His precise planning has allowed him to murder an untold number of victims without leaving a hint of a trail. Now investigators are interrogating the killer to attempt to determine the depth of his crimes and the motives behind his depravity. It seems a strange childhood may have played a role. Keyes grew up in the isolated woods outside of the small town of Colville, Washington. He enjoyed hunting and once remarked he would kill anything with a heartbeat.
I've known since I was 14 that there was things that I thought were normal and that were okay that nobody else was normal and okay. There were some friends staying with us, and there was a cat of ours that was always getting into the trash, and we all went up into the woods and took a piece of parachute cord, tied it to this tree, and I shot it in the stomach. That was pretty much the last time anybody went in the woods with me.
Well, when he was young, when he was about 19 or 20, he's committed his first violent crime against another person. He was watching a girl tubing on a river in Oregon from the woods, and he decided that he was going to take her and kill her. And he took the girl, grabbed her when she was separated from the people she was with. He grabbed her off the tube, dragged her up, and raped her, but then decided to let her go.
Is it just a dreadful childhood that turns these people into serial killers? The often asked question is whether it's nature or nurture. Is it a result of their upbringing, or are they born to kill?
That's a great question. I think that question is currently hotly debated, and it's something that it's been questioned now over about 250 years. Is someone born a criminal? Is someone made a criminal?
Behavioral studies theorize that the serial killer's dysfunctional childhood may lead to this, a cold-hearted lack of empathy.
Most research that I've seen has suggested it's the interaction between nature and nurture. It's the biological tendencies combined with the right environment to allow them to act out on those tendencies. If they have a predisposition to, let's say, be impulsive or be unempathetic or to commit crimes, parents could help neutralize that. But if they have that tendency and they have very bad parents, you can imagine that that tendency could just run wild and be exacerbated.
I think absolutely that there is something innate, there is something intrinsic, something that's within somebody to become a serial killer. I think that an environmental stimuli certainly can trigger it, and there are certain traits that or occurrences that will happen to somebody that may trigger it. But the bottom line is it's got to be something within them to make them that way.
Israel Keyes develops his love for killing very early in life, and he continues honing his murderous craft. Understanding Israel Keyes' motives for killing presents a complex puzzle for law enforcement. Another notorious serial murderer from Great Britain displays a similar psychopathic love of killing.
We understand that the police called on the owners of number 163 Melrose Avenue today because they own 2 dogs, and those 2 dogs might have picked up some of the bones from 195 Melrose Avenue and buried them in their back garden.
Police described it tonight as only a cursory search and said they will be checking other gardens in the street as well.
And I think it's right to say that we have found a significant amount of human bones, and also a part of a jaw with teeth attached to it.
Dennis Nielsen is one of Great Britain's most notorious serial killers, claiming at least 12 young men as victims. Like Keyes, his murders are motivated by the thrill of killing. But Nilsen's crimes appear to be driven by a morbid fascination with death and extreme loneliness. He would lure young male victims back to his home, strangle them, and plunge their heads underwater to be certain they were dead. He'd sometimes commit sex acts with his dead victims. Nilsen said he saved the corpses for a while to keep him company.
But at least 15 people paid the ultimate price for Dennis Nilsen's hospitality. He killed them, he chopped up their bodies, and he then burned, boiled, or buried the pieces.
12 of the 16 murders happened at Nilsen's flat in Melrose Avenue, North London. Each time he hid the body under the floorboards. Nilsen was asked by police how many bodies were under the floorboards at any one time. He replied, "I didn't do a stock check or anything, it's all a bit of a jumble."
Like Israel Keyes, Nilsen shows no mental break with reality. He displays clear and calculating thought. In 1983, after 5 years of killing, plumbing clogged with human remains and the body parts found by the dogs lead to Nilsen's capture. When asked about his motive for murder, Nilsen says, "Well, enjoying it is as good a reason as any." In 1998, after his troubled childhood, Israel Keyes joins the army. He starts to drink heavily and enjoys the company of prostitutes. But he also learns more valuable skills to help him intensify his experiences.
Keyes enlisted in the Army when he was about 20 years old. He was stationed at Fort Lewis, Washington, and so he learned survival skills, certainly in the Army. He learned how to handle weapons in the Army. These sorts of skills that he would then put to use for committing his crimes later on.
It was during this time he meets Tammy Hawkins, and together they have a daughter. After the Army, he lives with Tammy and his daughter in the lush forests of Washington's Olympic Peninsula, and it's thought that there he puts his hunting skills to the test on human beings.
So Keyes would typically try to find areas that were isolated. Parks were one of his favorite areas to scout, to stalk people. He would then wait for people to show up. He would follow them, he would track them as necessary, and then surprise them.
It appears Keyes murders 4 victims in the forests of Washington state, often disposing of the bodies in remote mountain lakes. His murders continue for more than 14 years, and law enforcement has no idea there's even a killer at large. Then in February 2012, Keyes kills Samantha Koenig close to home in Anchorage, Alaska. A rare impulsive decision for this calculating murderer.
So one of his primary rules was not to commit these crimes where he lived. And with Samantha, he broke his own rule.
This mistake of temptation has now led to his downfall. He's now under arrest and heading for trial. In Anchorage, the negotiations continue to try to get more information from Israel Keyes. Then suddenly, during a court appearance, he once again shocks law enforcement.
During one of the hearings in court for Keyes, he decided he was going to try to escape. And while the attorneys were up arguing before the judge, he bolted, tried to run out of the courtroom. But before he could even clear the aisle there, the courtroom deputies tackled him and subdued him.
In typical fashion, Keyes shows no remorse for his escape attempt.
I mean, come on, let's face it. Yeah, what happened yesterday? Ooh, I'm a bad guy. I tried to escape, but let's be honest. Nobody really thought I was a good guy before that, so...
During months of interrogation, Israel Keyes admits to killing at least 9 people. But investigators fear the actual total is higher.
And he was very evasive at times during interviews, and he told us when we tried to pin him down on a number, he would say it was less than 12. But then there were things that he would say that led us to believe that by less than 12, he simply meant 11. And so he was quick to correct us in interviews if we had something wrong. So there were several times where we just threw out statements like, you are 11 victims, or things like that, and he didn't correct us. So based on that and some just additional things that he said, we believe the number is 11.
He traveled so extensively, both in the U.S. and in other countries, for such long periods of time that authorities haven't been able to pinpoint where he was oftentimes. So the number of victims is going to be much higher than 11, in my opinion.
Israel Keyes begs the FBI for a quick death sentence, but the agents continue to press for information on other victims. Keyes grows impatient with the process and decides to take matters into his own hands.
On December 1st, 2012, while he was in prison awaiting trial in the Koenig case, Keyes slit his wrists and also used his bed sheet to strangle himself as insurance to make sure he got the job done. So as he bled out and as his body shifted, relaxed from the bleeding, he rigged the sheets so that they would strangle him to make sure he did the job. So he committed suicide while in prison.
In many cases with serial killers, they start at a very young age. They often start in their teen years. And I think historically, they never stop. The only way that a serial killer stops historically is if they're incarcerated or they kill themselves, which somewhat often they do commit suicide.
Crumpled inside the blanket on Keyes' deathbed is a blood-stained suicide note. The case of Israel Keyes reinforces the immense challenges facing law enforcement in their efforts to apprehend serial killers.
When you take a common murder case, you start at the nucleus of that person's life. Then you work your way out from there. With a serial killer, they're often just a random person, and that person does not even figure into that investigation. And it's somebody who's completely off the radar. How are you going to find them? You have to use modern technology, and you have to use old-fashioned police work, and you have to be absolutely relentless. You just got to keep on plugging.
Keyes is really unique in the world of serial killers, and the amount of preparation and planning he put into his crimes. He was so meticulous in his crimes that he's really a new breed of serial killer. He was extremely deceptive, extremely cunning. He got adrenaline rush from it. He loved the thrill of it. If he hadn't been caught, Keyes would still be out there doing it today. As a serial killer and as an individual, Keyes was deceptive and cunning as the devil.
A heartless killer hides in plain sight. It's a respected doctor, murdering his own patients.
He was preying on some of the most vulnerable people in society.
Dr. Harold Shipman's secret rampage lasts for decades.
He'd been murdering people for years and getting away with it.
And he's not the only one. There are doctors and nurses haunting hospitals, known as angels of death.
Are motivated by the kind of godlike power that they feel, being responsible for life or death.
What creates these cold-blooded monsters? What drives their warped psyche?
He did things that went above and beyond what was necessary to kill a patient. There was an element of cruelty.
Now, the actual voices and visions of serial killers.
I wasn't born evil, but you committed evil. I committed evil.
Plunge us deep inside their complex and twisted minds. June 24th, 1998. Dr. Harold Shipman arrives at the home of one of his patients, 81-year-old Kathleen Grundy. Kathleen has agreed to participate in a medical survey on older, healthy women. It's a terrible decision for the vibrant senior citizen.
She's a very busy person, wasn't she? A very busy person, yeah.
Well, she did do quite a number of charitable things and also community things.
Inside, Dr. Shipman has Kathleen lie down and roll up her sleeve. But rather than taking a blood sample, as Kathleen expects, Shipman injects her with a fatal dose of morphine.
I was just at work as normal, and then I had a telephone call from the police saying that my mother had died.
Stunned by their mother's sudden death, Kathleen's children contact Dr. Shipman for an explanation.
He gave us a death certificate and he said, I've put old age. And I mean, we knew perfectly well that that wasn't right. But then he sort of vaguely implied that that he'd seen her recently and so he knew the case, so it wasn't. And he was basically trying to say that he was going to avoid a post-mortem because that would be unpleasant for us.
The doctor's calm demeanor and reassurance puts the Woodruffs at ease. But 3 weeks later, they receive another shock.
The will, which some solicitors sent to me.
The fact that it left all of the estate to Shipman, which, I mean, if you'd known Kathleen in a relationship to us, to the family, that would have been extraordinarily unlikely.
Suspecting Dr. Shipman murdered their mother for profit, the Woodruffs contact the police. What they soon uncover proves unimaginable. The beloved doctor, a pillar of the community with over 3,000 patients, has been systematically murdering them for over 25 years.
Had Angela not come forward, there is no doubt that he would have continued to murder people. There was nothing that was going to stop him. He'd been murdering people for years and getting away with it.
Cases of doctors and nurses who kill have been documented throughout history. These horror stories highlight how people in trusted positions and access to vulnerable patients can abuse in the worst way possible. Oftentimes, these angels of death serial killers can go undetected for years.
Angels of death are serial killers who actually are abusing a position of power that they may have, where they could be a caretaker or a doctor, somebody who is supposed to be helping people, and they actually use it to kill their victims.
An angel of death is the name, a little bit too glorified in its essence, of nurses and physicians who kill one patient after another, usually by injecting one succinylcholine or some curare-like drug, and some of them have killed very large numbers of patients in that manner.
There seem to be a number of motivations behind that kind of serial killing, which doesn't involve torture or any sexual component. It's just sort of repeat murders. But it seems that some of them are motivated by the kind of godlike power that they feel, being responsible for life or death. Some of them will tell you that it was almost like coming from an empathy where they were putting someone out of their misery, that kind of a thing. And others were drawn to the kind of the egocentric thrill of having everybody run to see that, they were there at the moment that somebody started to die.
Dr. Harold Shipman is the most horrific example of an angel of death, becoming Britain's most prolific serial killer. Shipman owns his own practice, but specializes in house calls, visiting his elderly and infirmed patients in their homes.
Everybody, without exception, had the highest of praise for Dr. Shipman. What a wonderful doctor he was. And people said he was very, very accessible.
He had this reputation of looking after his patients from cradle to grave. He prided himself on personal care. He would look after patients at home where maybe we would send them to hospital. He sort of took pride in that, and he had a reputation of always being available for patients. He would go beyond the normal call of duty. He was the old-fashioned doctor who looked after them, did everything for them, and they had absolute confidence in.
Officials estimate over 200 times the beloved doctor injects his victims with lethal doses of morphine, often while offering a calming pat on their hands as they slowly pass away.
One of the defining features of Shipman is where he didn't choose to strangle them or do something that would be more frightening and painful. Instead, he injected them with an overdose of morphine, where they first went to sleep and then eventually overdosed and died.
Predatory, I think, is the best way to describe him. He was preying on some of the most vulnerable people in society.
Perhaps most astonishing is that Shipman gets away with it for over 25 years. As a boy, Harold was very close to his mother. She instilled in him an early sense of superiority that tainted most of his later relationships. While in his teens, Shipman became interested in medicine while watching his mother receive daily morphine injections to ease the pain she suffered while dying of lung cancer. One day, when he was 17, Shipman comes home to find his mother sitting in her armchair, fully clothed, dead. Her death has a very traumatic impact. In fact, many of the women Shipman kills are found in a similar manner.
Shipman had a passive-aggressive relationship with his mother where he both sought her attention, but he constantly was being rebuked by her, where she would put him off and she would put him down, but he constantly wanted her approval and attention. When he was 17, however, he came home one day and just saw her sitting there dead in her chair. And so that was very traumatic for him because he felt like he was never really able to attain that approval from her, and he no longer had the chance to do it since she had passed away.
In 1970, Shipman receives a medical degree from Leeds University. A few years later, he becomes a general practitioner in Yorkshire. Shipman thrives, specializing in pediatrics, obstetrics, and gynecology. In 1975, hospital officials discover he's been forging prescriptions for large amounts of the opiate pethidine for his own personal use. Caught red-handed, Shipman has no choice but to resign, pay a small fine, and enter a drug rehab program. After his rehabilitation, Shipman finds work again, this time at the Donnybrook Medical Center in Hyde. Here, Shipman earns a reputation as a hard-working doctor who enjoys the trust of patients and colleagues alike, although one with a reputation for arrogance.
Almost very condescending, as if dismissing you as you're viewed as being worthless, particularly when he was talking to pharmaceutical reps who would come in. He would take great pleasure in almost reducing them to tears.
It's not known when Shipman starts killing his patients, or exactly how many die at his hands. What is known is that while working at Donnybrook, Shipman kills regularly using the painkiller diamorphine. To destroy any evidence of poisoning, Shipman urges families to cremate their relatives. In a large number of cases, he stresses that no further investigation of their deaths is necessary. In situations where they do raise questions, Shipman provides computerized medical notes that corroborate his cause of death pronouncements.
I find all of his behaviour that's subsequently come out as almost incomprehensible, really. It goes against all our ethics and morals of why we do the job, really.
After 15 years at Donnybrook, Shipman leaves to open his own practice. The Angel of Death's murder rate accelerates, and the killings become more and more brazen. But before police can end these murders, they must first recognize there's a serial killer at large. How can they catch a murderer who has totally covered his tracks? Doctors and nurses who kill, so-called angels of death, often abuse their position for their own ego and godlike narcissism. History's most horrific example is Dr. Harold Shipman, who is reported to have murdered more than 200 of his patients. A series of killings lasting more than 25 years. His crimes first came to light in 1998, following the sudden death of a healthy 81-year-old woman, Kathleen Grundy. Investigators find that Shipman's murders accelerate when he opens a private practice in 1993. This is a one-doctor office where he works alone and without any oversight. No one is there to notice Shipman's death rates and prescription rates are extremely high. As is the case with other serial killers, the more Shipman kills and gets away with it, the more brazen he becomes, efficiently and ruthlessly murdering dozens, including in some cases, more than one person in a single family. Shipman would visit his victims, all females, most over 65, treating them as if he were an old friend. But then, after injecting them with morphine, Shipman often left them to die alone. He goes back to his office to backdate their medical records and falsify their death certificates, attributing the incident to natural causes.
I think one of the difficulties with that earlier investigation was getting over the sort of credibility gap was something that I refer to it as being, which was that, is it true what we're saying, that there was a doctor murdering people? He selected people who were vulnerable in the community, and they tended to be people who were living alone.
Another complicating issue in stopping Shipman is that he did not fit the typical serial killer profile. One investigator calls Shipman the dullest serial killer I have ever met. His benign appearance and affable demeanor, however, did belie his pervasive narcissism. Shipman's motives remain controversial. While some experts speculate he was seeking to avenge the death of his mother, others suggest it was euthanasia. Some believe there were financial motives, and others say it was for power and control.
For a lot of these angels of death, there is a literal God complex that they have where they want to feel like they have the ability in their control to actually give or take life. And so for them, they may choose, well, this person will live and this person will die. And for them, that gives them this huge ego rush where they feel like they're the ultimate God, they're ultimately in control.
There's also an element of the angel of death wanting to be perceived as a hero.
There's a theme within angels of death where they may actually be killing somebody, but as soon as others get aware to the fact that this person is dying, they actually will change their behaviors entirely to appear as if they're resuscitating this person, trying to save them. And a way to think of this is the arsonist who's actually the firefighter, where they're the ones who set the fire and then come there to put it out. They want that glory. They want to be the hero. And so they're not only able to kill somebody and get the gratification that comes from that, they're also able to get the gratification of appearing to be the hero in the scenario.
Shipman's killing spree finally comes to light thanks to the determination of Angela Woodruff, the daughter of Kathleen Grundy. Angela Woodruff is a lawyer and handles her mother's affairs. So it is with great surprise that she discovers a will exists, leaving the bulk of her mother's estate to Dr. Shipman. Detective Superintendent Bernard Postes comes to the same conclusion on examination of the evidence. Kathleen Grundy's body is exhumed, and a post-mortem reveals that she has died of a morphine overdose administered within 3 hours of her death, precisely within the time frame of Shipman's visit. On the same day as the exhumation, the police raid Shipman's home and office. The search yields hundreds of medical records, an odd collection of women's jewelry, and an old manual typewriter which was later proved to have been used to forge Kathleen Grundy's will.
He suggested that the typewriter was something that had been borrowed on a number of occasions by Kathleen Grundy. What he couldn't explain was when it was that she'd actually returned it, if that indeed that was true.
A review of Shipman's medical records makes it clear that this investigation extends beyond a single death.
This was the tip of the iceberg, was how I was viewing it at that stage.
Shipman would alter his medical notes directly after killing the patient to ensure that his account matches the historical records. What Shipman had failed to grasp was that each alteration of the records would be time-stamped by the computer, enabling police to ascertain exactly which records had been altered.
He wasn't as clever as he thought he was in being able to explain his way out of this.
On September 7th, 1998, the police arrest the 52-year-old Shipman for the murder of Kathleen Grundy. The news sends shockwaves across the community. As word spreads, suspicion mounts that there may have been other victims. Investigators decide they must dig up more graves.
Personally, it took a great toll on me. I would describe it as being the worst time in my life. Off the top of my head, I attended about 7 or 8. After a while, I got more used to going to the cemetery at 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock in the morning. To be in the cemetery at 4 o'clock on a cold winter dark morning, it got right through your bones. It was very, very unpleasant because as the remains were exhumed, you became very aware of the smell.
The exhumations and subsequent tests prove Shipman has been murdering a number of his patients. Shipman maintains his innocence, claiming he's been acting compassionately. But it is clear from the medical records and toxicology reports that none of his victims were suffering from a terminal illness. The police eventually charged Shipman with 15 individual counts of murder, as well as 1 count of forgery. On January 31st, 2000, a jury finds Shipman guilty on all charges.
Relatives of Harold Shipman's victims left court tonight knowing that one of the most dangerous men seen in Britain during the last century had been permanently removed from society.
Sadly, nothing that's happened here, nor can happen in the future, can bring back my mum and all the other victims.
I think it was mixed emotions. It was, again, satisfaction that he'd been convicted and been convicted of every one of the counts in the indictment.
Four years later, on January 13th, 2004, Shipman performs his last planned death. Alone in his cell, Shipman uses bed sheets wrapped around his neck and tied to the window bars to hang himself. Officially, Harold Shipman is convicted of killing 15, but ultimately he is believed to have murdered between 200 and 300 patients. One of the problems faced by investigators is that several victims had been cremated, making death certification impossible. Whatever the exact number, the sheer scale of his murderous activities means that Shipman is catapulted from a single patient killer to the most prolific known serial killer in the world.
He had this overwhelming sense of narcissism that he not only thought of himself as being so grandiose and so high above others, but he actually had this godlike concept where he felt like he could choose who he was going to kill, when, and why. And that's something that you see only with very extreme narcissists.
One reason Harold Shipman is able to evade authorities for so long was that his murders are scattered among his patients' homes. But incredibly, there is another angel of death who confines his murders to a spot people think of as the safest possible place: the hospital. Harold Shipman is a trusted family doctor who has been killing patients to experience a godlike thrill. Another angel of death is only a hospital orderly, but he gains enormous power by deciding who lives or dies. "88-year-old stroke victim Logan Evans lays helpless in bed, unable to control his bodily functions. When the orderly, Donald Harvey, arrives for his nightly cleanup, Evans smears feces onto Harvey's face. Suddenly, the 18-year-old orderly snaps, grabs a pillow, and smothers Evans to death. It is only after his victim is dead that Donald Harvey realizes what he has done. But rather than becoming scared, this act of anger empowers Harvey. Suddenly, after always being told what to do, he called the shots. He decided who would live and who would die. While working at Marymount Hospital, Donald Harvey, still just a teenager, murders 14 more patients. He later moves to other hospitals, and this despicable angel of death claims over 70 more victims. What could cause such a cold-blooded serial killer to emerge? Once again, an abusive childhood seems to come into play.
In childhood, Donald Harvey was pretty neglected by his parents. They were constantly fighting, and even though he was the eldest, he was more caring for his siblings than receiving the attention that a child should. Additionally, he was being abused sexually by his uncle and a neighbor, and so all of that was very traumatic for him growing up.
Harvey's killing begins in 1970, but he isn't apprehended until 1987. After his arrest, he lays partial blame on this childhood trauma.
The amount of trauma and abuse that Donald Harvey felt during childhood, even though it was severe, it became normalized to him, where he thought this must be what other people go through, or because he had no other experience, he just thought this is the way it is, and he knew nothing different.
Donald Harvey did things sometimes that went above and beyond what was necessary to kill a patient, so that there was an element of cruelty. So for example, while he killed the vast majority of his charges through poison, there was also incidents of him snaking a coat hanger into the catheter of patients to puncture the organs, to puncture them internally, so that peritonitis would set in and the individual would die slowly from that.
In 1971, when Harvey leaves Marymount to join the military, his killing spree stops. It picks up again when Harvey joins the nursing staff at the VA hospital in Cincinnati, Ohio. During his 2-year stint there, Harvey is believed to have murdered another 17 patients. And it was here that Harvey perfects the art of using cyanide and arsenic in small, lethal, undetectable doses so his killings can go unnoticed. And, for the most part, they did. No one who comes into contact with him knows the demons that lurk beneath his skin. The power over life and death goes to Harvey's head.
One commonality between the angels of death and other types of serial killers is the fact that they have a strong need for power and control. It's ultimately the most defining feature of the angels of death.
Harvey's killing spree at the VA hospital comes to an end when officials discover a gun, books on the occult, syringes, and slides of human tissue in his hospital locker. But rather than firing him, they let him resign, enabling Harvey to move on to another job, this time at nearby Daniel Drake Memorial Hospital. Just 6 weeks into his new position, the self-described Angel of Mercy strikes again. Harvey feels unstoppable.
It's easy to imagine how addictive it would be to be able to take someone's life, get away with it, and then be able to do it again and again and again, and the high that might come with that, and also the empowerment with every single time you do it, getting away with it.
In a span of 5 months, Harvey kills 6 more patients without any remorse and without leaving a trace. But eventually, in March of 1987, an autopsy is performed on a victim. As the coroner cuts open the body, he smells the telltale scent of bitter almonds wafting up from the dead man's organs. He immediately identifies the smell as cyanide. Suddenly, everyone working at the hospital becomes a suspect in a murder investigation. Rumors surface about how his co-workers nicknamed Donald Harvey the Angel of Death, not because they suspect any crimes, but because he is so often present when a patient passed away. Investigators decide to search Harvey's home and discover 30 pounds of cyanide. They also find, as did his former employers at the VA hospital, books on the occult and a list of victims yet to be killed by Harvey. On April 6, 1987, the police arrest Harvey, charging him with 1 count of aggravated murder. When they ask him if he had killed others, he simply nods. He doesn't know the exact figure, maybe around 70. Harvey consents to a chilling prison interview. In the session, he details the years of sexual molestation.
My uncle had started messing around with me when I was 4 years old. And he was 13 and I was almost 4. And what he would do with me would be in a sexual sense, and I thought all the other little boys would do the same thing. And since I act like my mother, act like a little girl, so he started messing around with me.
How long does this go on for, this sexual molestation of you?
Well, my uncle and I went on to, I was almost 21, and the neighbor man till I was 15 or 16. I don't like to think of myself as evil, no.
But people think you're crazy, you're mad.
Some do, some don't.
You're not mad?
No.
You chose to do what you did?
I chose to do what I did, and I can't blame. I can't blame my mother. I can't blame my uncle.
Why can't you blame him?
He contributed, but he didn't tell me to keep going on and on and on doing what I was doing.
How many people have you killed in total?
Just a total of 87.
Harvey is asked whether he thinks people are born evil or do they become evil?
I think everyone, unless they're born with some mental problem, I don't think anyone's born evil. I think it's man-made.
You weren't born evil.
No, I wasn't born evil.
But you committed evil.
I committed evil.
In exchange for escaping the death penalty, Harvey pleads guilty and confesses to 13 killings. He is sentenced to 28 life sentences.
A lot of times guys come up to me and say, well, I tell them I'm in here with you. I mean, you know, in the pod where I live. And they say, oh, he's evil, he's a monster. Because they immediately think, once you leave the street in cuffs, they think you become something else.
But very few people kill 80 people. What you did was monstrous.
That we know of. There's others out there. I'm not the only one, by a long shot.
On March 30th, 2017, Donald Harvey is found beaten to death in his prison cell. As horrific as his crimes appear, there is another angel of death that eclipses all others in the unspeakable brutality of their serial murders. One of the most insidious breeds of serial killers are the monsters known as angels of death. Doctors, nurses, and caregivers who murder their patients. Britain's Dr. Harold Shipman may be the most prolific serial killer of all time, murdering over 250 patients. While Donald Harvey, a hospital orderly, admits to 87 deaths. There have been numerous cases around the world of nurses, so-called angels of mercy, turning into angels of death. Perhaps the most heartless of all these serial killers is maternity nurse Maria Fikachkova. She is believed to have murdered at least 10 newborn babies beginning in 1957. Her killing spree ends abruptly 3 years later. February 23, 1960. 2 newborn infants are found dead in the Sadist hospital in the Czech Republic. Both are girls. One is 5 weeks old. The other is just 20 hours old. The babies are victims of extreme violence. Both have cracked skulls. Four days later, Maria Fikachkova is arrested for the crimes, and the 23-year-old nurse gives a gruesome confession and reveals a troubling past. She grew up in Sadist. Apparently, her father was abusive to Marie and her mentally challenged brother, and she often fought with her mother. But despite this difficult childhood, in 1955, Marie enters nursing school and is considered an excellent student with a bright future. Her school records give her a glowing report. Maria Fikachkova has completed all the prerequisites for her chosen profession. She will be a good, conscientious nurse and a reliable caregiver for babies. She is capable of handling responsibility and can work well independently. After graduation, Marie is hired at Sadist Hospital. By all accounts, she appears to be an excellent maternity ward nurse.
Like with other serial killer cases, Maria Fikachkova's peers were taken completely by surprise. Marie seemed to be a very professional, competent, and punctual person. This was very apparent, and at work she was very well evaluated. This isn't really surprising, as even serial killers have these little so-called islands of normality.
With her shocking confession, she recounts the numerous horrible crimes she's carried out over the years. She even poses for photographs, demonstrating how she murdered the infants.
Before killing the last 2 babies, named Prosser and Hammelbauer, I had beaten another 10 children who died as a result of my beatings. I want to add that I remember some of the names of the deceased children, and I gave those names to the prosecutors, but many of the names I don't remember.
She describes her first murder in 1957, 3 years before her arrest.
I don't remember the name of the baby or the mother, but I clearly remember beating the infant in the chest and head. That is what killed the child.
During her arrest, she acted very calm and natural. Her entire behavior can be summarized as resigned, and she lacked any empathy whatsoever. That means she described her crimes in the hospital with absolutely no emotion. She also mentioned that the first attack on the baby was committed without any suspicion by the others on the medical team. She understood this as a clear indicator of not needing to worry about getting caught, and she could just carry on with what she was doing.
Lékařského týmu, takže to vnímala jako moment, že se nemusí vůbec ničeho bát a že tedy mohla pokračovat.
Even crimes as heinous as murdering newborn babies are escaping detection. How can this cunning angel of death be stopped? In Sadist Hospital in the Czech Republic, a seemingly kind and compassionate maternity nurse named Marie Fikachkova is actually a serial killer. She has murdered at least 10 newborn babies entrusted to her care. In her chilling confession, she details how she killed 2 infants on the same day, February 23, 1960.
On February 23rd, around 11 a.m., I was in the maternity unit where I was ironing diapers. Hannah Hammelbauer was laying behind me. She was about 6 weeks old. She was crying, and it made me angry and nervous. That's why I turned and slammed her in the head, and with my hand slightly closed. I did it because I was upset and very stressed. They didn't know there was a problem with the baby until the next day when she wouldn't drink. The day after that, she died.
Marie continues, detailing her murder of the Prosser baby. The newborn is just 20 hours old.
When I was pressing the head of the Prosser baby, I felt my fingers pushing into her skull. I felt the scrunch of the head, but I wasn't sure I was breaking the bones. But I was aware that after this push, she stopped crying, but she had to die.
Na případu Marie Fikáčkové je zajímavé zaprvé to, že byla velmi mladá.
Maria Fikachkova's case is interesting because of her young age when she was committing her crimes. Also, the fact that she was committing these crimes on newborns. That is really atypical because killers in the angels of death category usually focus on old people nearing the end of their lives, usually suffering some terminal illness. Their motives are usually considered to be helping the victim. But in time, we discover that the real motivation is in power and control over the victims. She was beating the babies, beat them with her fists, beat them on their chests, beat them to their heads.
When police arrest Maria Fikachkova on February 27th, she reacts calmly and says she is actually relieved at finally being caught. The motive for Marie's serial murders is never clear. In her own confession, she claims she developed temporary feelings of pedophobia, the hatred of children, during her menstruation periods. Court psychologists declare Fikachkova to be sane, but they acknowledge she is prone to depression, hysteria, and uncontrollable outbursts of anger. On October 4th, 1960, Marie Fikachkova is sentenced to death for the 2 murders in February of that year. The courts are never able to confirm the earlier killings. On death row, Marie writes a letter to her mother.
Dear Mother, as you know, I am sentenced to death. It's very tragic, and I can't even think about it, that I will never be able to meet with you again. Because I still believe that there is some justice that will save me, but if not, I have to accept my fate.
On April 13th, 1961, Maria Fikachkova is hanged at Bangrad's prison in Prague. For years, there is outrage over why the hospital staff took so long to recognize the horrible crimes she was committing. But it is difficult to even conceive that these individuals we trust with our very lives could ever be so heartless. Caregivers, nurses, and doctors who kill attack the fundamental fabric of society. A stay in a hospital is difficult for anyone, a time when we are at our most vulnerable. Adding to that, a fear those charged with saving lives might kill is something no human being should ever have to endure. They are the most extreme killers in the annals of crime.
He made soup bowls from the skulls, shade pulls from human lips. He made a belt out of female nipples.
No predator is as depraved or bloodthirsty.
For someone like Jeffrey Dahmer, who received such gratification that he continued to do it over and over and over again, and likely would have done it forever.
They are driven by the darkest impulses and willing to destroy life to satisfy their compulsions.
There were certain necrophiliac sex killers who would murder victims and keep their corpses to perform sexual acts on until the corpses had reached an advanced state of decomposition.
These cold-blooded monsters are disconnected from reality, resorting to unspeakable acts to obey delusional orders.
His neighbor's dog was possessed by a demon and instructing him to go out and kill people.
What causes such a murderous defect in the human psyche?
Every now and then, a killer will come along whose crimes seem so monstrous that they seem like these supernatural creatures.
Now, the voices and visions of serial killers.
I'm not quite sure when I strike again.
Take us deep inside their complex and twisted minds.
Police in Milwaukee, Wisconsin are examining some macabre evidence of mass murder. Parts of human bodies have been found in a flat in one of the city's slums, an acid bath containing human remains, and photographs of dismembered corpses.
July 22nd, 1991. Milwaukee police raid the apartment of 31-year-old Jeffrey Dahmer.
Police think they may be the remains of 15 victims of yet another so-called serial killer.
Jeffrey Dahmer is the now infamous serial killer known as the Milwaukee Cannibal. From 1978 to 1991, he follows a terrifying pattern of picking up, charming, raping, and murdering young men. Dahmer's first kill comes in 1978. He picks up a hitchhiker named Stephen Hicks. After some beers, they have sex. But when Hicks wants to leave, Dahmer smashes his skull with a barbell. He then dismembers the corpse and stores the remains in the crawl space under his house. Killing is not enough for Dahmer. His crimes extend to necrophilia, dismemberment, and even cannibalism. He keeps skulls and body parts as trophies in his house. His ultimate plan is to build a shrine with the bones of his victims.
For someone like Jeffrey Dahmer, who not only killed but cannibalized his victims, he received such gratification from that he continued to do it over and over and over again, and likely would have done it forever until he had been caught.
Crime reporter Annie Schwartz writes a book about the murders, and she vividly describes what police find at the crime scene.
The crowd parted to make way for Milwaukee County Medical Examiner Jeffrey Jensen's white station wagon. In the apartment, Jensen went on about the business of rounding up the various body parts. He took the 3 plastic bags containing human heads found in the top freezer portion of the refrigerator and put them in another freezer. Dahmer had a separate waist-high freezer in addition to the one that connected to the refrigerator. Jensen then took the head Mueller had seen in the refrigerator and put it in the separate freezer with the 3 heads. He noted that next to the head in the refrigerator was an open box of baking soda and some ketchup and mustard.
As his killing progresses, Dahmer attempts to create obedient zombies by drilling holes in victims' heads and pouring in caustic chemicals. The escape of a potential victim eventually leads to the apprehension of Jeffrey Dahmer. Dahmer confesses to killing 17 men, but he pleads not guilty on the grounds of insanity. He claims to be psychotic.
The psychotic serial killer is somebody who's suffering from psychosis, which is a break from reality and having a lack of understanding what's real or unreal, and yet being able to commit these serial murders despite their psychosis. There are several manifestations of psychosis, such as having thought disturbances, hallucinations, or even just not understanding that what they're doing is occurring in the real world. They may think that they are told to do something, let's say kill someone, because they're hearing voices, or they may see something that's not there and choose to act upon it or kill someone because of it.
Snap, a break from reality, a loss of understanding and perspective as to right and wrong, being driven by a passion that one cannot control, a psychotic break. So for that instant, when this individual engaged in behavior, he lost complete control of what he was doing.
It's common for serial killers to claim to be psychotic. It's often an attempt to escape the death penalty or serve their sentence in a mental hospital instead of a prison.
From a legal standpoint, we get into the area of competency. And what that means in a court of law is whether or not someone understands and appreciates what they did, and most importantly, whether they knew it was wrong. And that's a decision that oftentimes is made by a judge.
After a 19-day trial, the jury returns the verdict. Jeffrey Dahmer is found to be legally sane and therefore guilty. He receives 16 life sentences, but is beaten to death in prison by a fellow inmate in 1994. So was Dahmer able to understand right from wrong? He carried on what seemed to be a normal life.
I don't think that any of us really knew how big this story was. When I got the phone call, all I was told was that some officers had found a head in a refrigerator and that he had obviously been killing men and kept some of their body parts. That's all I knew. And I got all the way out there and there was nothing there. It was really quiet. I asked a couple of the cops that were there, what was going on, and they just shook their heads. And eventually I was told that, that was what was happening. I went back around the front of the building and was allowed in by one of the residents. I ran upstairs and got in the apartment, everyone always wants to know if, what it looked like. And it doesn't look like a dungeon. It doesn't look like a chamber of horrors. It looks like a regular guy's apartment.
Jeffrey Dahmer, a serial killer, someone who for an extended period of time creates a fantasy world in which they are enjoying themselves. They are thriving in that fantasy world, still very often able to function in normal society as a regular person. They live in reality, then they exit reality and enter this world that they've created, which could be driven by so many different factors: sexual frustration, cannibalism, pornography, things of that nature.
There are some individuals who are psychotic in nature, who are being told by a voice outside of themselves to go and kill somebody, but they may be, again, engaging in that act to fulfill that fantasy, whatever that fantasy is, of how to strangulate the person or how to hang them from a beam in the basement while they watch. And they may exact pleasure from that, both sexual pleasure and gratification, that they are able to control the life of somebody, which gives them an immense amount of power, that I have the power to control whether you live or die, and they will watch them die.
Are these monsters crazy? Or is there a clear motive, like a sexual craving or a need for power and control? The question of whether these extreme killers are legally sane is a long-standing debate.
I think that what you'll often see is there's basically, at least in New York, a litmus test for people as far as the psychology of a murderer. And basically what that is does the person know that he's doing something wrong? And he could be talking to the moon. He may seem to think that he's a Martian or Napoleon Bonaparte, but if he kills somebody and then he lies about it, and then he hides the murder weapon, and he conceals the blood and he bleaches the floor, he knew what he did is wrong. So that's our litmus test.
Sex and torture are common elements of serial murders. But with psychotic killers, these components are not always involved. Like in the gruesome case of Ed Gein. It was a crime that shocked the small town of Plainfield, Wisconsin, and the country. Edward Gein, accused of killing a woman, then gutting her body like a slaughtered deer. Ed Gein executes his victims swiftly, without torture or sexual contact. He eventually confesses to 2 murders, but it's unknown just how many people he kills. These crimes originate from an unfathomable darkness, a depravity that earns him the name the Ghoul of Plainfield.
There are all kinds of horrific crimes that take place, but there are just a few killers that come along periodically whose crimes seem so monstrous that they seem like these supernatural creatures. Ed Gein was a necrophiliac serial killer who lived and operated in Wisconsin in the 1950s.
The repugnant nature of his crimes horrify and shock puritanical America in the 1950s, and truly leaves the small town of less than 700 residents with more questions than answers.
Gein would read the newspapers, the obituary section, and whenever some middle-aged or elderly woman had died and got buried, he would make these midnight raids on the cemetery. He would dig up the bodies of these women, bring the corpses back to his farmhouse, dissect them, make different kinds of household objects out of the body parts, He made soup bowls from the skulls. He made shade pulls from human lips. He made a belt out of female nipples. He would upholster chairs out of their flesh. But very, very notoriously, he flayed the corpses and fashioned them into a skin suit, and he would dress up in this skin suit and pretend to be his own mother.
A recurring theme in the psychology of serial killers is a deeply dysfunctional childhood. Ed Gein's father was an alcoholic and often absent, so Gein was isolated with his domineering and devoutly religious mother. She preached to her boys about the innate immorality of the world and her belief that all women were naturally promiscuous.
Ed Gein was interesting also insofar as he had a pathological attachment as a schizophrenic young person to his mother. And when the mother died, it's then that he embarked on his career of doing these terrible things, as though he was now reattached to his mother. His mother hadn't really died, even though she was actually a very wicked person to him, and she was very cruel to him. But nevertheless, it was the only human tie that he had.
Ed Gein, who was this kind of bizarre, quasi-psychotic, inadequate personality trying to create this suit. But he was also, when analyzed by professionals, was also found to have distinct psychopathic features mixed in with the psychotic qualities.
Gein is apprehended after abducting and murdering Bernice Worden. He kidnapped her at the hardware store she owned. Her decapitated body is found in Gein's shed, with her torso dressed out like a deer. Gein later admits to making about 40 nocturnal visits to local graveyards in a daze-like state. In 1968, Edward Gein is found guilty of murder, but he's judged legally insane and is remanded to a psychiatric institution where he dies in 1984. Gein's heinous crimes leave a permanent scar on the American psyche. The sensational nature of his acts also fuels a morbid fascination that spawns many books and movies.
Ed Gein, who was the inspiration not only for Norman Bates and Leatherface in Texas Chainsaw Massacre, but also the character Buffalo Bill in Silence of the Lambs. One thing that fascinated me when I first began to write about people like Ed Gein was how their stories are immediately turned into different kinds of folk tales and myths. They become these undying, immortal monsters in our collective psyche.
Jeffrey Dahmer and Ed Gein's horrific crimes shock their hometowns. But there is another extreme killer who terrifies an entire nation. Psychotic killers have gone down as some of the most infamous and depraved murderers in the history of crime. Their homicides have included despicable acts like dismemberment, necrophilia, and cannibalism. But contrary to popular myth, serial killers genuinely influenced by psychotic visions are extremely rare.
I think one of the most important myths for us to explode is the idea that people who commit serial murder must all be quote-unquote crazy or evil, from dusk till dawn, all day long committing evil acts. The reality is that very few of these individuals are actually going to meet criteria for serious mental illness, such as psychosis or mania.
Only a very small percentage of serial killers, less than 1%, are judged to be legally insane. Despite the rarity of psychotic serial killers, there have been notable cases. Serial killer Herbert Mullen was ruled insane when he murdered 10 people in the 1970s. Mullen hears voices emanating from his victims, convincing him the crimes are necessary to prevent catastrophic earthquakes in California. Richard Chase, known as the Vampire of Sacramento, is also a bona fide psychotic. He believes Nazis with ties to UFOs are attempting to turn his blood into powder. The antidote is drinking more blood. Chase often swallows an elixir of Coca-Cola and animal entrails and injects rabbit's blood into his own veins. In the late 1970s, Chase horribly slaughters 6 people, including a baby, and drinks his victim's blood.
Psychosis is certainly a serious mental disturbance. It's a genuine mental illness. This is the kind of mental illness where, you might hear voices in your head, or there are delusional elements to what's going on, and you might believe that you have to do things. I mean, there's psychosis that might bring with it a certain degree of paranoia. Somebody's chasing me, or God's told me to go and kill a certain kind of class of persons.
More interesting question that people often ask is, are serial killers insane? It's important to recognize that sanity and insanity are not clinical terms, they're legal terms. So it's very, very difficult to prove that a serial killer, even though the acts he commits seem totally mad, is insane. Because the legal definition of sanity is you can tell the difference between right and wrong.
David Berkowitz, the son of Sam serial killer, launched a 13-month reign of terror in New York City beginning in July 1976. Berkowitz used a .44 caliber pistol to kill 6 people and wound 7 more in random attacks. His victims of choice appear to be young women with long dark hair. Donna Loria and Jody Valenti are shot while chatting in a car. Donna DeMasi and Joanne Lomino are victimized while sitting together on the stoop of a house. Berkowitz says the Sam in his nickname comes from his neighbor Sam Carr. He claims Sam is a high demon who transmits voice commands through his dog, ordering the murders.
I think that David Berkowitz is quite possibly a revenge-motivated serial killer. I am suspect about whether he really believed that Sam Carr's dog was demonic and speaking to him, and I suspect that he was gaining his satisfaction from taking revenge against women. This was a terribly lonely man. David Berkowitz worked in the post office on the Grand Concourse in the Bronx. It's a huge, beautiful granite building. And here's this man who's alienated, doesn't have a girlfriend. He has this flood of mail that's coming through this building, a tidal wave of human connection. Birthday cards, Valentine's Day cards, love letters. All this human connection is flowing around him, and there he is alone. He's completely alone, and he quite possibly was very angry at all the beautiful women walking past him on the sidewalk on the Grand Concourse. He was going into lovers' lanes and shooting lovers. He was going after pretty women walking down the sidewalk. This has all the earmarks of someone taking revenge against that alienation, against that separation.
Raymond believes that, like many serial killers, Berkowitz was faking his psychosis.
If you see some of his statements, he was talking about his neighbor's dog was possessed by a demon and instructing him to go out and kill people. It would seem as if all of a sudden these demonic voices ceased upon his arrest and his incarceration, making it somewhat suspect that that's really what it was. I think that you'll often see with serial killers that they will make excuses for their murderous crimes. You'll see them blame it on something or somebody or an entity. make up an entity like Sam Carr's dog.
A lot of people would assume that they're all psychotic or crazy, but if you think about it, if you are mentally impaired, it's actually a lot more difficult to function, let alone commit these types of crimes, which leave a lot of evidence behind, which are very difficult to commit, and to be able to do it so often that you're able to gain serial killer status. So if you think about it, it's actually very difficult to be mentally impaired and commit these type of crimes. But that being said, psychopathy is very common among serial killers.
Psychopathy is a complex disorder that has been recognized for centuries.
They used to call it moral insanity. Back in the 19th century, again, when they had serial killers, and before they had the term psychopath, they were trying to figure out the psychology of these people, because these were people who were very rational and often very intelligent. They were not subject to delusions or hallucinations. They seemed just like you and me, except they had no morality, they had no conscience, they had no ability to empathize with other human beings. They saw other human beings merely as objects to be exploited and used for their own depraved pleasures.
In the 1880s, German psychiatrist Richard von Krafft-Ebing wrote the classic textbook, Psychopathia Sexualis.
And it is a very, very shocking book in many ways, because Krafft-Ebing is very, very graphic in his description of the kind of acts of the criminals he talks about. And again, some of them, even nowadays, are really beyond the pale. There were certain necrophiliac sex killers, for example, who would murder victims and keep their corpses with them to perform sexual acts on until the corpses had reached an advanced state of decomposition.
The book even describes the Jack the Ripper case while the crime is still fresh in the news. The bodies of women were found in various lonely quarters of London, ripped open and mutilated. It is probable that he first cut the throats of his victims, then ripped open the abdomen and groped among the intestines. In some instances, he cut off the genitals and carried them away. In others, he only tore them to pieces and left them behind. He does not seem to have had sexual intercourse with his victims, but very likely the murderous act and subsequent mutilation of the corpse were equivalents for the sexual act. The crimes of Jack the Ripper terrorized London. But a century after his heinous crimes, a new serial killer strikes fear throughout the nation. A maniac known as the Yorkshire Ripper. Many extreme serial killers perform unspeakable acts. A great challenge for investigators, psychiatrists, and the courts is to determine if these murderers are legally insane. To unlock this complex puzzle, they often look to the offenders' childhoods to determine how they became such monsters. Research shows that as children, they often suffered significant abuse, sometimes psychological, sometimes physical, often sexual. There was usually a long history of psychiatric problems, criminal behavior, and alcoholism within the family.
Often they might share disrupted or broken childhoods in the sense that their family lives, their socialization patterns are atypical, they're not common. Perhaps family breakdown, family violence, all those sorts of things.
Jeffrey Dahmer claims to have been sexually abused by his neighbor when he was 10 years old. His parents were constantly fighting and divorced when he was 17. Both his mother and father moved out, leaving Dahmer alone with his growing paranoia and terrible fantasies.
Clearly what's operating there is what we would tend to call these days a paraphilia. That kind of sexual preference may not emerge until the teens, early teens or late teens, and that's partly might be derived from experimentation and so on, and it might also produce different kinds of emotional reactions. So the teenage years, the years when we develop our kind of courtship and our and our sexual relationships with others, that can be a very disturbing period, and it can, of course, go awry.
Because of their extreme social isolation and general hatred of the world, they often profess to have felt suicidal as teenagers. They display a strong interest in deviant sexuality and are obsessed with violence, voyeurism, and pornography. Their fantasies drive their murderous acts.
What's interesting is, as you sort of carefully examine the lives of a lot of these serial sexual offenders, is that each crime seems to almost represent an attempt to live out the fantasy in a more and more perfect way. If they prowl until they find an individual that perfectly, fits the character. It's almost like working for central casting or something. We have to find someone who's just right appearance-wise. Sometimes they'll even alter the appearance of the individual with a wig or makeup or worse to make the individual look like the character they have in mind. But it's important to understand them imagining themselves almost like a director of a scene, where they're calling all the shots for once.
A century after Jack the Ripper terrorized London, a new serial killer strikes fear into the residents of England's northern counties. Peter Sutcliffe's homicidal rage lasts 5 years, claiming the lives of at least 13 women and wounding 7 more. He slaughters his victims with a hammer, chisel, screwdriver, and knives. The crimes earned Sutcliffe the nickname the Yorkshire Ripper.
Peter Sutcliffe was born in the northeast part of England in the York, Leeds area. He eventually ended up wanting to kill one prostitute after the other. He was often just at the edge of being captured, but they couldn't quite accumulate enough evidence in the pre-DNA days to certify that he was the person.
When Peter Sutcliffe is 20 years old, he works as a gravedigger in a cemetery. He claims he is driven to murder prostitutes by voices he hears emanating from tombstones. Sutcliffe is a quiet, pleasant, and handsome young man, and no one suspects he is capable of such heinous acts. Sutcliffe develops a loathing and at the same time a fascination with prostitutes. By now he is married and holds a good job as a long-haul truck driver. In 1975, he attempts 2 murders in July and August, but both women survive his hammer and knife attacks. But the voices drive him forward. In October, he successfully kills his first victim. 3 months later, he bludgeons a prostitute and stabs her 50 times. There's no schedule for Sutcliffe's murders. The next is 13 months later.
And as time goes on, what happens is that just like someone who's addicted to drugs, there's some evidence that biologically this may be literally true, that the same brain areas that subserve drug addiction might be at play in individuals who repeatedly commit homicide, become addicted to it. They need more and more of a fix, more and more power, more and more of a horrible crime to satisfy that need.
Sutcliffe butchers another prostitute 6 months later, but the police investigation gains little traction.
Obviously, the people that go to the prostitutes, the punters, as we call them, their clients, they are very, very reluctant to come forward indeed. We don't expect them to be coming forward cheerfully on occasions of this nature. And possibly the third aspect of it is that members of the public, because it's a prostitute, do not feel affected themselves. Had it been the murder of a young baby or a young girl, then I think we would have had far more people trying to volunteer information than we have because it's a murder of prostitutes.
But then his murders take a frightening turn. His next victim is not a prostitute. It's a 16-year-old schoolgirl. Now terror grips the North Counties. No woman is safe. Police go house to house, desperate for clues.
Hello, love. Hello. We're doing house-to-house inquiries regarding this murder that happened on Saturday night.
Yeah.
Do you mind answering a few questions, please?
Go ahead.
Have you seen these photographs in paper?
Yeah.
That's a young girl there. Oh, those are the clothes that she was wearing on Saturday night. Do you remember, were you out on Saturday, you know, saw anyone like that?
No.
The Yorkshire Ripper continues on his murderous rage. West Yorkshire Chief Police Investigator George Oldfield is asked if he thinks the Ripper will strike again.
I think there's every possibility that he will. The big question is when and where. My fear every Sunday morning when the telephone rings is, are we in business again?
Citizens are in a panic. There are no concrete leads. Finally, in December 1977, the police get a lead that points to Peter Sutcliffe. But the Yorkshire Ripper slips through their grasp. Extreme serial killer Peter Sutcliffe is butchering young women at an alarming pace across England's North Counties. At first, it's only prostitutes, but now all women are in the crosshairs of this maniac murderer. Police search frantically, but they find no concrete clues. Until a brand new £5 note is found on one victim. It's traced to the salary payment made to Peter Sutcliffe. Sutcliffe's wife can't believe Peter is the killer, and she supplies an alibi. Within days of his police interview, there is another attack. But the victim survives, and a police sketch artist creates a very close likeness to Sutcliffe. The frenzy to catch the Ripper intensifies. Sutcliffe continues his trucking runs where he would sleep in the cab. Pinned up in one of his windows is a chilling note. It reads, "In this truck is a man whose latent genius, if unleashed, would rock the nation, whose dynamic energy would overpower those around him. Better let him sleep." During the first 5 months of 1978, there are 3 more victims. The public pressure to capture the killer is intense. George Oldfield and his team are desperate for leads. Then, in the spring, there are astounding developments. Taunting letters from the Ripper that seem to be authentic. And 3 months later, a tape recording from the killer.
I see you are still having no luck catching me. I have the greatest respect for you, George, but Lord, you are no nearer catching me now than 4 years ago when I started. I reckon your boys are letting you down, George. They can't be much good, can they? I should be in the bigger records. I'm not quite sure when I'll strike again. But it will be definitely sometime this year. Maybe September, October.
On September 2nd, 1979, another victim, seemingly verifying the warning on the tape. A huge publicity campaign is launched to enlist the support of the public to help catch the killer. A special newspaper is printed and delivered to over 1 million homes. And a tape is broadcast with a plea for assistance.
Over the past 4 years, 12 women have been horribly murdered and mutilated by a sick, sadistic maniac, the Yorkshire Ripper. How can we stop this madman from killing again? Here's one way. Listen.
I'm not quite sure when I'll strike again. But it will be definitely sometime this year.
Have you heard that voice before? At work, or in a pub, club, on a bus, or in a queue? Think. Do you know somebody with a northeastern accent like that, who lives in the Leeds, Bradford, Manchester, Preston, Halifax, or Huddersfield areas? Or who travels there from your area? If so, phone your local police.
The case now gains worldwide attention, and leads pour into the police. More than 1 million man-hours are devoted to analyzing the clues. The pressure and immense workload leads to 8 divorces within the Ripper Squad. Hundreds of wives report their own husbands as the Ripper. But in the end, it's determined that the letters and recording are a hoax. The Yorkshire Ripper remains on the loose. Police have spent thousands of hours chasing leads on the Yorkshire Ripper, only to discover the letters and tape recordings they're analyzing are just an elaborate hoax. Meanwhile, to help avoid capture, Sutcliffe decides to change his murder signature and starts to kill by strangulation with a rope. 2 more victims up the Yorkshire Ripper's death toll to 13, with 7 more brutally attacked. Then finally, on January 2nd, 1981, police find Sutcliffe parked with a prostitute. He slips behind some shrubbery, claiming he's urinating. He tries to hide his weapons, but on questioning, he's caught in several lies and arrested. At the police station, he faces intense interrogation, and he says, "You think I'm the Ripper, don't you?" Detective Sergeant Des O'Boyle says, "Well, what about it?" There's a long pause, then Sutcliffe says, "You're right. It's me." At his trial, Peter Sutcliffe is found guilty and sentenced to life in prison. But shortly after his conviction, prison psychiatrists examine the killer and declare him legally insane. He's then transferred to Broadmoor Hospital to serve his sentence. Peter Sutcliffe's father never understands what drove his son, and he grieves for the victims and their families.
Our hearts go out to all the families of the victims, whoever they are, wherever they are. We must carry that burden, as well as Peter, for the rest of our lives. After all, he is my son, and I want every father in the country to be glad that it was my son and not theirs.
As a homicide detective, Malcolm Raymond specialized in sexual predator and serial killer cases. All too often, he was confronted with the gruesome results of extreme serial killers' madness.
Every crime scene speaks to you, so you have to examine a crime scene in great detail and look at the little details. The horror of the situation is something that you have to move past in order to get your job done. You're not a robot. You do feel these things, and they're absolutely horrifying scenes. And I think that what happens is you'll think about it later. That'll come back to you later. When you're at the crime scene, you have a job to do, and it's a technical job, so you have to move past that. You have to grit your teeth and get past that, and then you deal with it on a personal or emotional level later on. And being at a crime scene is so much more intense. You can look at pictures or films, but when you smell it, when you get the smell in your hair and your suit, when you're stepping over brains and blood, trying not to get it on your shoes, when you're staring at a dead body and the lifeless eyes are looking back at you, it's a surreal life.
Raymond speaks for all police officers who track these murderers, describing the importance and the difficulty of apprehending these monsters and the satisfaction of finally bringing them to justice.
To get these cases solved, you have to be absolutely relentless. You can't give up. You have to remain focused. You have to be absolutely relentless. When you go down an avenue and it hits a dead end, you got to find another way around it. And you can't give up. You can't throw up your hands because it's up to you. Nobody's going to do it for you. You've got to do it.
How satisfying is it when you get it?
It's incredibly satisfying. It's God's work. You're giving justice to the dead. You're giving justice to that person's family, to their loved ones. And there's also another effect that a lot of people don't take into account. You're saving people who haven't been victimized yet, people who would have been killed had you not done your job.
It's a match made in hell. Serial killers who murder as a team.
We have two people who individually might never really commit this kind of crime, but sometimes form this very, very toxic partnership.
Sometimes one is the psychological leader, the other a compliant accomplice.
That one is the dominant driving force and the other acting out of love or is acting out of loyalty or fear.
Often they are a romantic couple, driven by deviant sexual thrills.
You find these couples who get into serial murder as a form of a really grotesque, horrific form of sex play to spice up their lives by abducting and torturing victims.
So a lot of times these are motivated by somebody trying to have an apprentice in a way where they're leading them on, they're showing them the ropes, and that alone gives them pleasure. They feel good about it. And in some cases, it's because they actually need the help.
What causes such a murderous defect in the human psyche? Now, the voices and visions of serial killers take us deep inside their complex and twisted minds. These are the legendary English moors, the vast open grasslands of the United Kingdom. Like the remote American deserts, forests, and lakes, these beautiful landscapes are ideal for hiking, camping, and experiencing nature. They are also isolated spots where sometimes criminal acts evade detection and serial killers hide their victims. Forensic investigators and volunteers are searching the area known as Saddleworth Moor, near Manchester. They are hunting for the body of Keith Bennett. Keith was the third victim of the serial killer team known as the Moors Murderers, Ian Brady and Myra Hindley. From 1963 to 1965, Brady and Hindley kidnapped, sexually assaulted, and murdered 5 children, ranging in age from 10 to 17. Keith Bennett was just 12 years old when he was killed. Keith's family had been looking for Keith's remains for nearly 40 years with the help of many volunteers.
There's no way I'm going to give up. No ways. I will not rest. I will not stop until Keith's home or until I physically cannot do it.
The search is frustrating. Essentially, it's like finding a very tiny needle in a gigantic haystack. Surprisingly, from prison, Myra Hindley has sent them directions for where to search for the body. She's provided a sketchy map to help them find Keith. Myra claims she stood lookout on a ridge while Brady took Keith deep into a gully to brutalize and murder the youngster. Nevertheless, the search is leading nowhere.
The moor itself is a difficult place. People do not understand that. Finding things up there is hard and difficult, as our task so far has proven.
A big change down there. I would think it'd be nearly impossible to remember where he'd buried anything.
Hindley has agreed to assist in the search, hoping this will enhance her case to be released from prison early. In 1966, she and Brady were convicted of murder and given life sentences. Over 20% of serial killers operate with an accomplice. Myra Hindley and Ian Brady are classic examples of this breed of deadly duo.
Often you will find these pairs who seem to be examples of what criminologists sometimes call a folie à deux. Folie à deux is a French term meaning a madness shared by two people, but now it's more generally applied to a kind of crime where you have two people who individually might never really commit this kind of crime, but sometimes form this very, very toxic partnership.
Sometimes there's the main person, such as in the case of Ian Brady, who used his girlfriend Myra Hindley to lure children to a very remote place where Ian would then strangle the little child and record the screams of the strangling child on a tape recorder, which he would then use later as a kind of sexual turn-on for him and Myra later in the evening.
The Moore's murderers first met when Myra Hindley went for a job interview at a small chemical company in Manchester called Millwoods Merchandise. Ian Brady was working there as a shipping clerk. She was immediately attracted to the tall, handsome, but strange young man. According to reports, Brady was interested in pornography as a schoolboy. He was also very cruel, torturing kittens to see how long they took to die, and his psyche remained the same long after his capture.
And Ian Brady was simply sadistic, and a very awful person.
He didn't show remorse at all. What he did show that he was someone who was quite determined to do the things he did. He was quite sober in a sense as to what he was saying, and I just felt that he was very ill.
For their first date, Ian takes Myra to the movies to see Judgment at Nuremberg, a film about the Nazi war trials after World War II. He introduces her to the writings and recordings of Adolf Hitler, as well as sexual sadistic works of the Marquis de Sade. The couple becomes inseparable. They make a good team. He's socially awkward, but she's just the opposite, and they both share a fascination for sadistic cruelty. In prison, Myra pens hundreds of letters to her mother, along with an unpublished autobiography. And these writings offer rare insight into the minds of a serial killer team. In her writings, Myra claims Ian indoctrinated her for over a year and a half to the idea of her being his accomplice in murder.
That does seem to happen often with these team killers, that one is the dominant driving force and the other draws a kind of a sense of purpose, or is acting out of love, or is acting out of loyalty or fear or sort of for the other individual, and so can sometimes be a rather heinous person themselves.
In her letters, Myra describes Brady's better side and how she enjoyed relaxing times in the country in places Ian had visited on his motorbike. These were days of tranquility for her, and she treasured the time they spent together, always hoping for a normal domestic life. But any possibility of a normal life disappears on July 12, 1963, when Myra offers 16-year-old Pauline Reed a ride in her van. She tricks her into going to Saddleworth Moor to help her look for an expensive lost glove. Ian follows on his motorbike. When they arrive, Ian takes Pauline onto the moor, rapes her, and cuts her throat. Myra Hindley claims she was not present during this or any of the other murders. But despite the claims she makes in these later writings, Myra continues as an accomplice in the next murders.
There are some cases of a tag team serial killer group where one person is often leading the efforts and another person is sort of assisting in the serial killing role. So a lot of times these are motivated by somebody trying to have an apprentice in a way where they're leading them on, they're showing them the ropes, and that alone gives them pleasure. They feel good about it. And in some cases, it's because they actually need the help.
When you have two partners that are killing together and one is sort of afraid of their cover being blown, so is the other one, what happens is that when the two engage in these acts together, they then protect one another's secret, because if you turn on me, I'll turn on you, and so forth. So you develop a kind of a handshake, that you're going to protect one another's secret. And that creates an intimacy that, in a bizarre way, is almost like a kind of a love for some people. Letting that one person in on your twisted secret kind of a thing.
4 months after the murder of Pauline Reed, the couple offers 12-year-old John Kilbride a lift home. But they take a detour to Saddleworth Moor. When they reach the moor, Brady takes Kilbride with him while Hindley waits in the car. He sexually assaults the boy and slits his throat with a 6-inch serrated knife before strangling him with a shoelace. Over the next 2 years, the killer couple murders 3 more children: Keith Bennett, 10-year-old Leslie Ann Downey, and Edward Evans, who was 17.
They've murdered someone, life is life. But in her case, it's 5 children. 5 little children. I mean, killing an adult is bad enough, isn't it? But not 5 little harmless children like that. We've had a lot of heartache for a long, long time. And it'll never ever stop. The heartache never goes away.
Myra Hindley always claims she was never there when the children are killed. Although in the courtroom, a tape recording of Myra Hindley shouting at a 10-year-old Leslie Ann Downey not to spit out a gag provides a key piece of evidence in her conviction. Leslie Ann's mother is in the courtroom when the tape is played. She has to endure hearing her baby pleading for mercy and crying for her mom.
She couldn't be human to stand there and let a little girl, so innocent, 10-year-old, say, please let me go home to Mummy. And just say, shut up, else I'll give you another guy that died. Don't get me wrong, I hate him. But I detest her to stand by and let a little girl plead to her. Where was her motherly instincts? And she made a remark in the paper that the only thing she's sorry for that she never had any children. God forbid she did. I wanted to die in prison. I think she should die in prison. The horrific things she's done, She took the most precious thing in the world away from me. My only daughter.
Now, decades after these horrific crimes, the investigators hope they can trust the twisted mind of a team serial killer. Ian Brady and Myra Hindley are serial killers who work as a team. In the 1960s, they kidnap, rape, and murder 5 children ranging in age from 10 to 17 years old. Both, only in their 20s themselves, are convicted of murder and sentenced to life in prison. Myra claims Ian bullied her into abducting the children, and that she was never there when they were killed. To prove she's repentant, she agrees to help with the search effort. Hindley's attorney, Michael Fisher, reads her letter claiming she will help the police.
I received a letter, the first ever, from the mother of one of the missing children, and this has caused me enormous distress. I have agreed to help the Manchester police in any way possible and have today identified from photographs and maps places that I know were of particular interest to Ian Brady, some of which I visited with him.
We are looking to hopefully find the graves of Pauline Reed and Keith Bennett.
The families and police have been searching for almost 40 years, and now they believe they are finally on the right track. They hope Myra Hindley's guidance has been truthful. In prison, Myra has written hundreds of letters to her mother, as well as a revealing autobiography. At the heart of her autobiography lies her troubled childhood and an abusive relationship with her father. She says she hated him and depicts the man as a violent bully. Myra seems to have developed an interest in sadism early on, but when she joins forces with Ian, this interest explodes into action.
When you have this group together where they are both feeding off each other and encouraging each other, you may see just because neither of them wants to back down or say, no, I don't want to do that, they may actually commit crimes and do things that they otherwise would have never done by themselves.
Ian Brady was born in a Glasgow, Scotland slum to a single mother who gives him up for adoption when he is 4 months old. Brady is a lonely, difficult child who develops a fascination with the Nazis and sadism. Soon he turns to petty crime and burglary and ends up in prison at the age of 17. Following his release, he becomes even more of a strange loner until he meets Myra Hindley in 1961. His sadistic personality leads him to murder and a desire to document his heinous crimes with tape recordings and photographs. Brady and Hindley are eventually caught when Ian Brady makes an uncharacteristic mistake. He beats Edward Evans to death in front of Myra Hindley's brother-in-law, David Smith. After the killing, Smith alerts the police. When the police enter the house, they discover the body, and Ian Brady is arrested immediately. Over the next 3 days, officers uncover a large cache of souvenirs of the murders and evidence that links Hindley to the crimes. The photographs quickly lead the police to the bodies of Leslie Ann Downey and John Kilbride. The public is outraged over the murders. 24,000 people sign a petition demanding the couple be hanged. The 14-day trial reveals the horrendous details of the crimes, confirmed by the audio tapes and photographs. The jury finds Brady guilty of the murders of Downey, Kilbride, and Evans. The bodies of Bennett and Reed have not been found, so those cases are not included. Hindley is convicted of the Downey and Evans homicides. Both are given multiple life sentences. Over the years, the Moores murderers maintain a bond even though they serve in separate prisons. Myra's sentence indicates she cannot be paroled for 26 years, but she grows increasingly desperate to get out. Has this cunning and heartless killer convinced the world she deserves to be set free?
She's typed as the more evil of the two, when in fact all the evidence plainly points to her having a lesser role. Now for that she should indeed have been severely punished, but the two cases are to be distinguished, and yet she's got the same time in jail as Brady, who was a psychopath before he met her.
I shall find her wherever she is. I shall find her. I've said this for 20 years. That woman will not live if she comes out of prison. I know people have said they'll do it for me. I don't want that. I don't want nobody to get in trouble, especially my boys. They've got their lives to live. I'm half dead now. I'm living on pills. I will willingly do that woman in and take my punishment, and I will expect to be put in prison where I should stay until the end of my days.
The serial killer team of Ian Brady and Myra Hindley are serving life sentences for their atrocities. Myra continues to deny any involvement in the murders and cooperates with authorities. Her unwillingness to confess to any involvement makes her a figure of public loathing. Then, in the mid-1980s, 20 years after their crimes, Ian Brady tells a journalist that there are 2 other bodies buried on Saddleworth Moor. Police reopen the case. Hindley helps locate the body of Pauline Reed and also agrees to continue to help find the body of Keith Bennett.
I do know now, indeed. I've settled it quite recently which body that we're looking for there. The body, in fact, that we took from the moor earlier this week, I am now sure is that of Pauline Reed.
Hindley finally admits her guilt.
She's confessed that she is guilty of participating in these crimes, so that she would be guilty of the crime of murder, yes.
Brady then volunteers to help as well and is taken to the moor to help locate the last victim. The search is in vain, and some believe Brady was just trying to get another thrill by revisiting the crime scene. So what creates these depraved couples? A cutting-edge new tool is now available to allow much greater insight into the minds and motivations of all serial murderers. Radford University and Florida Gulf Coast University have created the remarkable Serial Killer Database. Researchers and students have compiled an astounding wealth of information on over 5,000 serial killers from the year 1900 through today.
Specifically, we have 186 variables related to serial killers, such as early childhood issues, parental abuse, humiliation, and we have that data from at least 5 or 6 different sources that allows us to make sure that the data is accurate and valid. And this allows us to develop a profile on serial killers relative to these factors.
As for serial killer teams, the database results show that about 22% work with an accomplice, and often the team is a man and a woman.
The research is telling us women are viewed as compliant victims and not major perpetrators. Under the gender bias, that women can't be as tough and as mean and rotten as men, so they must have been forced into an accomplice role here by these vicious men and so forth. So in a couple of cases, we're finding women turn state's evidence, and as a result, only receive from 10 to 15 years incarceration versus the men who ended up on death row for very similar kinds of crimes. And we're also finding that the women in some cases were far from compliant victims.
The database reveals interesting facts about the relationship between killer couple Charlene and Gerald Gallego. This team first abducted their victims, primarily teenagers. Most were kept as sex slaves before they were killed. The total count is 10 teenagers who lost their lives.
In the case, for example, of Charlene Gallego, she had an IQ of 150, was an accomplished pianist, and was extremely shrewd. Gerald Gallego, her husband, conversely, had an intelligence quotient in the double digits. And they both would simultaneously seek women as their prey. And they would choose 2 women at a time, one that suited Charlene's purposes and one Gerald's purposes. At another point, she actually left Gerald. So the capacity to leave someone under those circumstances, then followed by a decision to come back to this environment, really dilutes the suggestion that being a compliant victim really applies in this situation.
The Gallegos are arrested after a friend of their last victim witnessed the abduction and gave police the license plate number of the Gallegos' car. Gerald is sentenced to death at San Quentin State Prison, but dies in 2002 of cancer while awaiting the execution. Charlene cuts a deal with the authorities and testifies against her husband. She spends 16 years behind bars.
But there's a shift now to treating women equitably as heinous perpetrators, as opposed to just compliant victims. It's another area of research right now we're looking at.
The data shows there are also many instances of two men working together as serial murderers. American serial killer Henry Lee Lucas claims he has murdered hundreds of victims. In more than 100 cases, he says his partner in crime was Otis Toole.
The last count was 600. I gave over 3,000, I think 3,608 confessions, I think is what it was, of cleared homicides.
So it's a perverse version of two heads are better than one, with Otis Toole being probably psychotic, intellectually impaired, and Henry Lee Lucas, sort of being the one who was the more dominant of the two.
The two killers not only shared the thrill of killing, they sometimes raped their victims as well. Their prey included essentially anyone they ran into: hitchhikers, prostitutes, and migrant workers. And their heinous crimes even extended into other deviant sexual acts.
For example, Otis Toole and Henry Lee Lucas, well, there wasn't really predominantly motivated by rape so much as a desire to commit necrophilia and cannibalism.
Mm-hmm.
So you had a necrophile and a cannibal working together. Otis Toole, who infamously created a barbecue sauce for eating people and all this sort of thing. They hooked up and, sort of the idea was you had two people who were getting their needs met together.
The couple is notoriously known for the murder of Adam Walsh, the 6-year-old son of John Walsh, host of TV's America's Most Wanted. Toole was the one to kill Adam after abducting him from the mall in Hollywood, Florida. 2 weeks later, a fisherman finds the boy's severed head in a canal 120 miles away near Vero Beach. It took more than 20 years before the boy's parents learned the truth from Toole's niece after the killer had died in Florida State Prison. Lucas makes several claims to be an accomplice in the murder, but he retracts them, and the police never prove his involvement. The serial killer database also reveals compelling information about the role of abusive childhoods in creating these monsters. Along with humiliation, a pattern of being bullied is also recognized in the data.
And we call that in our database teasing, which coincides with bullying. But bullying has a very serious impact on one's propensity to engage in these behaviors. Now, that doesn't mean that everyone who's been bullied is going to become a serial killer. I think the key here is to look at that in conjunction with other variables.
Both Lucas and Toole were bullied by their abusive mothers.
Brutalized wasn't the name of it. I was beaten with sticks, whatever she'd get in her hand. If it was a piece of stove wood, she hit me with it. If it was a rock, she hit me with it, She'd take poles and just pound the devil out of me, I've got scars all over my body from it.
Lucas's rage builds up after years of this terrible abuse, until he finally snaps and kills his own mother.
My mom was a prostitute, and she sold herself, and I was made to watch her. And it was just a life that I don't want,
And Henry Lee Lucas, who, had actually necrophilically assaulted his own mother after killing her.
Hate builds up inside of a person. It takes away his reality, because all reality left me. Things that I would go around or be around just was a blank to me,
Toole's childhood was even more abusive. He was assaulted by almost every person he thought he could trust. His mother dressed him up as a girl. His older sister raped him before he turned 10, and his father, the worst of them all, prostituted him to a neighbor when he was only 5 years old. Clearly, abusive childhoods are often found in the backgrounds of teen murderers, whether it's two men or a man and a woman. One of history's most horrific killer couples began with a domineering man and his submissive teenaged wife. But over the years, she learns to become an equal partner in unspeakable evil. Serial killers who act as a team are responsible for some of the most despicable murders in the annals of crime. Sometimes the deadly duos are two men who are friends or relatives, and sometimes the couple are romantically involved, often a man and woman that get sexual thrills from their despicable homicides. Fred and Rosemary West are a married team of serial rapists and murderers who slaughter more than 16 young women beginning in the 1960s. Their gruesome signature is chopping off the fingers and toes of their victims. While Fred is still a teenager, he becomes a child molester and burglar. At 21, he marries Rena Costello and becomes stepfather to her daughter from her first marriage. They soon have a daughter of their own. When Fred is 28, he meets 15-year-old Rosemary Lett, and the two fall in love. Rosemary's family is immediately suspicious of Fred.
We were all shocked and dismayed, really, because Fred was quite a bit older than Rosemary, quite scruffy looking, and his first impressions when you tried to make a conversation with him was he was an out-and-out liar.
The family has no idea Fred is still married to Rena.
We only found that out some months later when there were various other things that kept cropping up that we were finding out about. The one was his marriage. There was another one about he had been in prison.
Soon, Rena disappears, and then her first daughter, Charmaine, also vanishes. Fred claims they moved to Scotland.
Charmaine, we was told, preferred to be with her mother, and that was the reason why she disappeared. And Scotland was a very long way away at the time, although we loved Charmaine, all of us, dearly. But it was maybe a little bit strange that she suddenly wanted to go back, and not to say cheerio.
Rena and Charmaine's murdered bodies are found years later. Meanwhile, the West's neighbor, Liz Agius, notices Fred and Rosemary's unusual lifestyle.
As I got to know Rosemary and Fred West, Rose started telling me about her personal life. How did I feel about it? She was a prostitute. I just told her what, it was her business, it was nothing to do with me. She did go into details that she had like microphones or something in the bedroom, because if she ever had clients there, Fred was always on the opposite side into the next room, and he likes to listen to things like that. Weird, absolutely weird, but their life, it was up to them to whatever I thought turned them on, and you know, I never took no notice really. I liked her for what she was, and you know, as a friend, what she did in her own business, or in her own life.
Liz quickly grows nervous about Fred.
Well, he started off a casual conversation like, how are you, where have you been? And then as time went by, it got to sex. He always talked about sex. He used to say to me, what I could do with you in bed, would I like to try it with him? If I like, I can have 3 in the bed, him, Rose, and myself. How would I feel like if I went on the game? It was just sex, 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 sex mad.
Before long, it becomes clear that there are troubling things happening at the West's home.
He said to me that he likes to go around finding young girls so that because they've run away, they've got no home, he will support them by giving them a roof on over their heads, and if they want to go on the game, work for him. Then one day, Rose knocked on the door. She said she was going out with Fred. And I said, well, why are you going with him, you know? And she turned around and said to me, as long as there's a woman in the car with a male, there's always an easy chance for another girl who they're going to pick up will get inside the car because she will be there with him.
In the cellar of the West home, young victims are subjected to brutal sexual assaults. After binding them and taping their mouths shut, the Wests carry out acts of sexual perversion and torture. Some of the victims die in the process. Others cannot be allowed to live. Fred hints at what's going on to his neighbor when he shows her his cellar.
We went down there, and Fred said he wasn't sure what to make of this yet. He said, I don't know whether to make it a playing area for the children. Or he nudged me and he used to say, or else I could make this into my torture room and things like that. He said, just think, he said, what I could do to you down here if he said, nobody will hear me. He said, because I'd make it soundproof. And I used to say, keep wishing. Once me and Rose was I was in what they call the sitting room, but there was beds as well inside there, in this room. I was sitting on the settee, Rose was making a cup of tea. And the next thing, Fred came behind from the door, put these handcuffs on me, and I was quite nervous on it, and then Rose turned around and said, get them friggin' off her, you know, just like that. And without any hesitation, he took them off. He said, I was only joking.
Still, the neighbor doesn't comprehend what's going on in the West home.
All I knew is that Rose was a prostitute, and they both had other women as prostitutes, but I didn't see any. It was only what they told me. I didn't know they was going to kill anybody or torture anybody. You wouldn't have thought that they were the type of couple to have done that.
It's not hard to understand her not knowing the truth, because what's actually happening in the home of Fred and Rosemary West is simply beyond comprehension. Deadly duo Fred and Rosemary West are systematically torturing and killing young women in the cellar of their home at 25 Cromwell Street in Gloucestershire, England. The address is soon to become the most notorious in Great Britain, as the West's killing spree has gone undetected for over 20 years. Like many serial killers, both Fred and Rosemary endured violent, abusive childhoods. Rosemary was the fifth of 7 children. People found her slow, and she had trouble making friends. On the surface, the family seemed ordinary, but in fact, there was terrible abuse. Rosemary and her brothers and sisters suffered frequent beatings at the hands of their tyrannical father, Bill Lett, who was a diagnosed schizophrenic.
He was a madman, complete madman, when he was in these rage of temper fits, whatever.
Nobody was excluded from it, my mother included. And we all lived under this threat of what he would do next.
Fred and Rosemary form an inseparable bond, a devoted connection forged in murder.
Always happy, always
pretty
little thing, yeah. And then one day she wasn't there anymore.
Over the years, the couple is investigated, but charges are never filed, despite the fact that the police suspect links between the growing number of missing women.
So in police circles and local gossip between police officers, strongly believe that one person is responsible for all of those killings, and the presumption is that person would be local. Serial killer, well, that wasn't a word bandied about in the 70s, but yes, you could call it that it was quite firmly believed that one person was responsible and that he could well have been a local person. But who that person was, well, we didn't know it was Fred West, that's for sure.
The sort of youngsters staying at Cromwell Street are the ideal victims, many of them having just recently left home.
They were like me, you know. They most probably didn't have a lot of money and they were probably enjoying life to the full. Maybe they didn't have their relatives close by. Or maybe they'd fallen out with their family for some particular reason. Very much the same as myself.
I think we will find that we will actually notice clusters. And when I say clusters, we will notice that in one particular area there are more people going missing than other areas, and it could point the finger that there's something not quite right there.
Over a 20-year span, the Wests torture, murder, and bury 9 young women at the Cromwell Street home, including their own daughter. It seems astonishing now that they managed to do it without anyone noticing.
No child protection service in the United Kingdom, in the then state of knowledge and the procedures which then applied, could have anticipated or avoided this terrible set of tragedies.
These two went to extraordinary lengths to prevent detection, and I think we need to keep that in mind and not look and try and second-guess people who were perhaps doing the best they could in difficult circumstances in the past.
Apparently, police missed a valuable clue when a video store owner reported Fred peddling deviant sex tapes.
He said he actually made them in his house, and he said he'd done some involving his daughters. They were sex videos and lesbian romps and different things like that. And then he got into a conversation, had I heard of snuff movies, the actual real snuff movies, where they actually done it. And I couldn't understand that a man could talk to somebody about things like that. So when I got home, we talked it over, and I phoned the police the next morning, and I gave him the name and the address, and he said it would be investigated.
Heather, the West's second oldest daughter, was about to become the last known victim in 1987. Liz Agius could have been next on the list.
I look at it that I'm one of the lucky people to be alive today, because when I think about it, I think, were they trying to find out if I was going to be one of the people that if they picked on me, would I be missed?
Finally, in 1994, the couple is caught. But Rosemary denies any involvement.
She was devastated, quite clearly distressed and shocked.
She denies she knew anything about the bodies, is that correct?
Yes, she does.
What does she say about knowledge of the killings at all? She totally denies that.
Yes, she does.
But I find it very hard to believe that she lived in that house and didn't know what was going on.
In the face of the evidence, Rosemary is sentenced to 10 life sentences, one for each victim killed, including Charmaine.
This morning, Rosemary West was charged with the murder of Charmaine West between the 1st of May 1971 and the 31st of December 1971.
By the end, it appears that the relationship between this killer couple has changed.
I would have said Rose was the more dominant. It was obvious that he was very, very much in love with her. He loved her. The way things were, he would have done everything and anything for her.
Rose had changed then. I mean, she got more domineering then. She got this...
Secretive.
No, no. Secretive, and
yeah.
What she said went, and that was it.
On January 1st, 1995, Fred West commits suicide, rather than face the same sentence as his wife. He strangles himself in his prison cell. Today, researchers are hoping that tools like the serial killer database may eventually help reduce the frequency of serial killers.
So if we can identify these variables, we can identify these killers at early ages if we see these behaviors and take remedial action immediately by which to preempt any further activity in the future.
The hope is to never have monsters like Fred and Rosemary West at large in the world.
I punish myself every day for it, for not asking enough questions, for for just not finding out more and maybe stopping it before it happened.
I can't forgive because Rosemary knew right from wrong. I'm her brother, but I can't possibly forgive anyone for cruelty to children, let alone murders.